right. Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. Today, I'm extremely excited to have Hiram Rivera with us. A couple things up front. Thank you to our newest member, Monica. Also, a lot of folks in the chat are definitely excited, um, to hear this conversation. So thanks for coming through. Good to see you all. Um, and so I'll just introduce Hiram and we'll get right into it. This is a conversation that he and I have kind of been talking about a little bit for a while. And really, I think since probably August or September, when we connected at an event that was hosted at the Abolition School. Shout out to the Abolition School. Also, we'll be doing actually, the proper name is the W.E.B. Du Bois School for Abolition and Reconstruction, I believe. But we'll be doing an episode with them next week as well with their staff. So I'm looking forward to that as well. So let me do the little introduction. Also, of course, do the things, like, subscribe if you haven't. Share the video, please. Like, get folks in here to hear this, or share it afterwards. It will still be up, of course. So for folks who don't know, Hiram Rivera is an organizer, a popular educator with 20 years experience working on issues of education justice, carceral abolition, and political prisoners. He's led local and statewide campaigns in his native New Haven, Connecticut, as well as New York City and Philadelphia, PA, where he currently lives. Hiram has been an organizing trainer for the past 7 years with the School of Unity and Liberation, or SOUL, in Oakland, and the George Jackson Organizing School, which he co-founded in 2023. He's the former executive director of the Philadelphia Student Union, co-founder of the organization Black Men Build, and currently serves as the founding director of the Community Resource Hub, a national organization providing research, training, and technical assistance to groups across the country running defund and police abolition campaigns. Hiram, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
It's great to have you. I'm glad to have you here.
I'm excited.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's just jump into it. For folks who aren't, I read out your bio there, obviously. For folks who are less familiar with you and your kind of experiences, can you just talk a little bit about some of your background, your story as an organizer, kind of both within nonprofit organizing spaces, obviously some of the spaces we just named, also within either party or like revolutionary mass organizing spaces. And including, I think the political prisoner work is an important thing for you. So yeah, go ahead.
Cool. Yeah, again, thanks for having me. It's not all the time I get to do this. So shout out to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. And shout out to the folks over at Black Power Media who have definitely always had me on. So like you had mentioned, I grew up in New Haven, Connecticut. My parents were both working class neighborhood, predominantly in Black and Puerto Rican neighborhoods. Typical experience for everybody else. I think the change for me happened when we went to high school. So I went to high school, got moved out to the suburbs. So an affluent white suburb in Connecticut. And that was the first time that my world got rocked and kind of set me on this trajectory, right? It was the first place I got called nigger, the first place I got called all kinds of jigaboos and spics. It was the first time I had to, really experience classism and didn't know what to do with that. And so I go to school from 91 and 95. 92, Malcolm X, the movie comes out. And from there, I'm like, that's what I want to do, right? I started out the Nation of Islam and then left that before I graduated high school and moved into political prisoner work, and specifically through the Puerto Rican independence movement. So by the time I got to 19 years old, I had started to become politicized through the Nation of Islam. But then in that, right, learning more about Black revolutionary struggles, and through that process of understanding myself racially, which I hadn't up to that point. I was like, I'm Puerto Rican, right? That's it. Coming into that awakening then led me back into the Puerto Rican struggle, but through a different lens, right? And understand the colonial reality of Puerto Rico that led me into the political prisoner struggle. So both the Puerto Rican political prisoners at that time, and what was the Vieques struggle at that time, the bombing of the island of Vieques by the U.S. Navy, and also the struggle of New African political prisoners. And so doing a lot of that work as a teenager and into college, mostly letter writing campaigns, fundraising, petitioning, that sort of thing. That grew into ultimately two roads. One, being sworn into the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party in 2004. And then on the flip side, after a trip to Cuba and meeting, right, then exile, Nahanda Abiodun, joined the Malcolm X grassroots movement in 2005. And so for a long time, those were sort of my revolutionary political homes, and where I was doing most of my work, again, primarily around the issue of political prisoners, but also Puerto Rican independence, New African independence. At that same time, I'm going to school. So I was going to the University of Southern Connecticut State University, and I run out of money. And I can't finish school because I ran out of money. You get into debt. And so until you pay the debt, you can't get the loans, right? It's the whole bureaucracy of trying to go to school when your family has no money for college. And I unfortunately left school after my junior year. So I left 1 year before graduating and didn't have enough money to go back. I spent the next couple of years unemployed because I just couldn't get a job. Nobody would employ me, nowhere. And was getting into a really bad mental place and mental situation, right? And being a young man, early 20s with no job in the hood, right? You get labeled, you get branded, you get dismissed very quickly, really fast. And it started to weigh on me. It started to weigh on me really, really heavily, right? And I didn't want to feel like I was a failure. I didn't want to feel like I was a loser, but there was so much out of my control. I find a AmeriCorps flyer. Someone I think gave it to me and was like, "Hey, we have this program, AmeriCorps." I had no idea what that was, but they were paying, and it was like, you join this program called Public Allies, which has its roots in Chicago with the Obamas. But I had no idea who these people were at that time, right? And all I knew was that they paid money, $16,000 for the year, right? Which was nothing. But when you have nothing, you'll accept anything. And what that program did was that it put folks, they find folks in the cities, right, in urban neighborhoods, and they put you in nonprofit organizations as some sort of like training thing, right? It's pretty much free labor, cheap labor for the nonprofits themselves. And then if the organization likes you or you do good, there is a possibility that you can be hired on as staff. And so I got placed at a youth media organization called Youth Rights Media that was training high school students in New Haven how to produce video documentaries around issues impacting young people, and then running organizing campaigns around those issues. So when I got brought on, the issue was closing the Connecticut Juvenile Training School, which is actually a maximum security prison for boys 14 and under, because the state of Connecticut was sending juveniles 16 and up to the adult system. And that is my entry point into the nonprofit world. Having no idea that these things existed. I didn't know you can be paid to do what sounded like, radical and revolutionary work. I'm working with young people. I'm teaching them all this cool stuff about the Black Panthers and about systems of oppression and stuff. We're fighting to close this youth prison down, right? And that's how it starts. And from there, it takes me to New York City, where I worked for the Brown University's Annenberg Institute for School Reform, but specifically the youth wing, right? So Annenberg had an office in New York City where they were running organizing campaigns. And what they were trying to do was merge the intellectual side of what was being produced at Brown University with actual on-the-ground practice to be organizing. And so through the Urban Youth Collaborative in New York City, coordinating a coalition of youth organizations in the city to run statewide and local campaigns around cops in schools, statewide funding, yada, yada. And then lands me here in Philadelphia at PSU, doing a lot of the same stuff.
Right on. I mean, you and I have a lot of my experience is different, of course, but like there's a lot of overlap in terms of some of these sites. I worked at Harlem Children Z for 5 years, and
Hmm.
we were like the largest, I think, AmeriCorps employer
Yeah,
in New York, and you know, I mean, I worked a lot of time early in kind of administrative. Well, first I worked in the after school program, but then in administrative side of things. And like the attitude that the institution had towards AmeriCorps people was basically like, I mean, I don't even want to say some of the ways that it was thought of, but it basically, in a sense, the idea was, oh, you need people to work Saturday, like
yeah,
give it to
yeah,
them. Work Sunday, give it to them. And y'all had like a set number of hours that you had to complete in order to fulfill your program, which then also could help with educational funding.
yeah,
But like you said, it was like, I don't know, 13, $16,000 a year. And
yeah,
you're working like, you could be working 60, 70 hours a
yeah,
week.
yeah,
And so,
easily.
um, it is really, yeah, it's 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 like almost quasi slavery for like nonprofits, but it's
Yeah.
totally built into this like, I mean, it's a very neoliberal thing because like the way that it was used at Harlem Children's Zone is that they would get AmeriCorps to be teachers assistants in the public schools, funded through
Hmm.
the nonprofit. And so this
Hmm.
was then how the public schools would get some teachers assistants because there wasn't enough
Right,
funding to go to the schools to actually pay their own,
right,
right? And so you would get teachers assistants for, whatever, $15,000 a year, whatever it
right.
was. And they could work all those hours, and then they could do after school programs on top of that and stuff on Saturdays if they
Exactly.
needed to, right? And so, yeah, it's
Yeah,
wild.
no, I got lucky with my placement, um, with the work that I was doing, but it didn't free me or protect me from just the overall bureaucracy and the insidiousness, right, of the whole system as a whole. Because to your point, right, we're working like an incredible amount of hours, and this is where I'm thinking like, well, yeah, this is the revolution, this is the struggle, so you got to be all in, right? Um, in my like 22-year-old brain or whatever at the time, right? Um, but then the instant you try to like fight back, so there's a group of us, who started because you have this there's chapters all over the country, right? And so there's public ally programs all over the country, and you have this listserv that you're all on, and so you can chat with other folks, right? In other public allies across the country, because they're like, oh yeah, you're all a part of this family. You're all, it's pizza for everybody, right? That sort of thing. Um, and everyone's complaining is like, yeah, I'm only making nothing, right? It pays nothing. Um, and so we're like, we should start a union. And so we're on these chat boards like we should start a union because this is right. This isn't fair. We're taking advantage of. And that's when I start getting the messages from the home office in Milwaukee, right? And that's when they're like, all right, we're gonna put you on probation. If you keep this up, we're basically gonna just kick you out of AmeriCorps, right? And that's where the beginnings like these things aren't lining up. This is supposed to be like some sort of radical fight the power thing, but something as simple as like a union or paying us a little more than $16,000 for the year. Now I'm being threatened to be kicked out. And at the time, again, I was like, I had been employed for 2 years. I didn't want to lose that little piece of change that I had. So I'm like, all right, I'll cool, you know what I'm saying? I'll cool out as much as I can. I think I was put on probation like twice in a matter of 10 months, right? Um, but what they also have you do is because it's all about this is an opportunity for you. Yeah, it sucks. But what we're getting almost like college football, right? Like we're giving you this scholarship. You could blow your whole ACL out. You could, but we're giving you this free tuition while we're making $60 billion at the University of Texas for ticket sales and all of that, right? AmeriCorps is kind of the same thing. It's like, yeah, we're not giving you anything. We're asking you to pay all this, but you could be hired at that organization, right? Or you get all this training that could be used somewhere else. And so this is for your benefit. And part of that benefit was also being selected to be on the board, right? So you represent your state on the board. So I get selected, the one who's put on probation every other week, right, is selected to the board. And what that was you get this training and they have you lobby for AmeriCorps in Washington, D.C. And so you become free lobbyists, right? So you're knocking on, so whoever your state representative is at the time, it was fucking Joseph Lieberman, right? And these folks knocking on,
Perfect.
yeah, knocking their office, meeting them, and be like, "Hi, I'm a constituent from your state. Little old me was just a, nobody black boy in New Haven, Connecticut, but now look at me," right? Um, and it just felt weird. Now, because of my involvement in the Puerto Rican independence struggle and understanding the colonization of my country and my membership in the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party, I don't vote, right? And we don't vote in colonial elections. We don't do that, right? And so all of Washington D.C. and then just the history that I was learning, reading Malcolm, I was like, this is Babylon. This is what am I doing, right? And so I just kind of stand off to the side and just watch. And it culminated with the cherry on top of all this was in 2004. This was 2005. 2005 was going to meet Barack Hussein Obama, right? And we're going to take you to the senator's office or whatever. We're going to meet. This is after the whole Democratic, speech at the DNC and thing or whatever. And they march you in, and you meet Barack Obama, right? And this is the epitome of like, this is what AmeriCorps can do for you. This is what your nonprofit work is going towards, right? And that there can be more young people like you, and and this is change, right? And he's sitting there and like, oh, thank you so much for all the things that you all are doing and the work that you, right, and all that stuff. But basically filling you in your head with this idea that the work that we're doing and the nonprofit work that is happening is somehow reshaping the United States, right? It's creating a better United States for people like me, for folks back in my city, for the young people that I'm working with, right? Those young people who are incarcerated, who are trying to close those prisons, that this was the way. Voting, your nonprofit, right? Stand in line, don't ask for unions, right? Hope and change, that sort of thing. And that experience itself, which I had to be, and for transparency, I had to be coaxed into walking into the office. I kind of stayed outside in the hallway. I was like, I don't want to go in there. I don't want to do this. They're like, you have to go in there and don't embarrass us, Hiram, because I had been on probation some time. I got talked to so many times in that DC trip. They were like, don't embarrass us. Don't say nothing crazy. Don't threaten these people. I don't know what they were thinking, but they say, don't threaten these people. I'm like, all right, whatever.
Yeah, right on. I feel like you and I could do a joint like neoliberal nonprofit therapy session or something like that. And maybe we'll do that at another time. Because as somebody else brought up just quickly, that they used to, aspire to work at Harlem Children Z and be
Yeah.
Jeffrey Canada. And like I just share quickly that so he was an alumni at the college I went to, and he came and spoke. And I was so inspired by him as a person that I was like, I want to go work there. And I had a friend whose mother worked there in HR, and that's how I initially like got in the door of it. I wasn't because I wasn't involved in any, revolutionary organizations or things like that. Like I pretty much drunk the Kool-Aid. And it took me a while. It was later on that politicization is a funny thing because I was politicized a certain way, but I kind of got depoliticized by all of that into a more neoliberal framework through all of it. And then later on, shifted back. But it it's a wild, wild world. So one of the things that we want to talk about is the role of the nonprofit industrial complex broadly within Black radical organizing spaces, particularly looking at kind of the last 10 years. You're someone who I think has, great insight on this and experience with it. What are some of the ways you think these structures meaning nonprofits, have forestalled or hindered more radical possibilities in that time frame? So just I'll leave that as a general question. We can get into specifics more maybe through it, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So, and I tell you this off the air, right? I like to really like dig deep into things because I don't know who's listening. And so I always approach these talks with the assumption that there are a lot of folks who have never heard these things before. It's the organizer in me, right? And so I like to really explain to them. And the purpose for me being here really is to talk to other nonprofit workers, right? To talk to the other folks who are in those similar situations as me, so they can have a clear sense of what it is that we're working in, what are the spaces and the context that we're doing this work in. So nonprofit organizations right, created as charitable organizations at the beginning of the 1900s, right, with robber barons like the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, the robber barons of that time who were making wealth hand over fist, right, with the industrialization of the country, with the colonization of the Caribbean and the Philippines in 1898, right, the advent of private property, the holding of resources in these factories for the intentions of making profit. These folks are making an enormous amount of wealth, right, as we're leading into what is the Great Depression, but also the great imperialist wars, right, in Europe, that they're all fighting each other in World War One. And so you have these individuals who are making more money than they've ever made in the history of the world, right? And they create these charitable organizations to hide their money and shield it away from taxation. And so, under the guise of providing support to the poor and the needy, right, they put all their wealth in there to hide their money away from taxes and from being scrutinized, right, by the federal government. And so, the 501c3 nonprofit is a tax classification that includes a lot of organizations. And so what we're here talking about today are the ones that we normally see in our organizations and who kind of lead marches and mobilizations and actions. But nonprofits include universities, they include religious institutions, they include your credit unions, their co-ops, fraternal or associations, your pension trusts, right? Like the nonprofit sector is the third largest sector, right? Employer of folks in the country, right? In the private sector, that grows according to a report of the independent sector, right? That it grows 4 times faster than any other for-profit company, right? These nonprofit institutions, right? And so, what is their role? Like all institutions inside of a bourgeois dictatorship, inside of this ruling class dictatorship that we live on, they all are rooted in counterinsurgency. They all are rooted in the point and purpose of upholding and maintaining, right, ruling class order, ruling class control over everything. And so, what has these nonprofit organizations looked like from the times of the robber barons up until this point? You start seeing them really kick off into this new way of what they're doing around the civil rights era. And so, they provide financial sustainability for organizations, right? They provide money, they provide a level of bureaucracy and order, right? And what they do is they bureaucratize social justice, they bureaucratize social change and radical movements, right? They silo our struggles into independent struggles, right? And so now you don't have sort of like a mass movement. What you have is, well, there's the education justice sector, and there's the housing justice, and there's the reproductive justice, and there's the whatever. And all these groups don't work with each other. They all don't interact with each other because the funding doesn't allow for you to do that, right? And so through philanthropy and through these ruling class elites who have now gone beyond just the Carnegies and the Rockefellers, and now they all have institutions where they shield their wealth and their finances. They use these institutions to merge their wealth with ideology. Ruling class folks definitely have a worldview, and they have interests, and they have a number of projects that they're moving globally and nationally. And through these philanthropic institutions, they're able to merge their wealth with that ideology, right, to start moving these things at the ground, both for the left and the right. A lot of times when you think of nonprofits, you're thinking of like the BLMs and those sorts of things, right? Lefty, woke organizations. But the right also has nonprofits. They have their philanthropic institutions. They just use them very differently and way more strategically. And so what does that look like, to answer your question directly? What it starts looking like at the civil rights movement, with giving fellowships to folks like Dr. King and other members of the Southern Leadership Congress, right? It looks like funding trainings. So these trainings are basically to fund folks in this sort of liberal mindset, right? Liberal thinking, training these leaders who are coming from the ground, who are coming from communities themselves, giving them these prestigious fellowships, giving them a whole lot of money, which is how I ended up in there, right? Under the guise of being able to fund your struggle, to support your struggle. And by the way, we're going to also add these advisors who can help you do this. And we're going to add, this here and this there. And before you know it, what you saw with the civil rights movement was that with the funding that was coming from groups like the Ford Foundation and other large philanthropic organizations, they moved the struggle from Black radicalism into Black capitalism, right? Then it was about Black businesses. It was about, the sustainability of the Black community through dollars, right? That sort of thing. It was about elected officials and getting folks elected. It was no longer about that sort of thing. As you move into the turbulent times of the 60s and the 70s, right, with the Black Panther Party, with the BLA, and struggles around the decolonial struggles around the globe, then you see these philanthropic organizations start to play a bigger role, right? And so if it is things like I said on the right, funding think tanks. So the Chicago boys who develop neoliberalism as we know it, right, do that through grants that are coming from philanthropic organizations. It looks like collaborations with the CIA to prop up nonprofit or charitable organizations in other countries to undermine the decolonial struggles that are happening in Africa and in Asia. It looks like, giving folks fellowships and propping them up as the leaders of the movements, as the leaders of the community who are spouting, right, liberal politics or spouting messaging that is in line with what the powers that be want them to do, right? It looks like, again, funding struggles, Ocean Hill, Brownsville, right? The fight for community control of schools in Brooklyn, New York, right? Where the foundations were in there funding, again, the leaders and giving them fellowships and giving them positions and roles to steer them away from that sort of thing. It looks like, to tie it to today, the first police foundation is developed in New York City in 1970 with a $300,000 grant from the Ford Foundation, right? We know now police foundations exist all over the country to raise funds on top of the budgets, the already inflated and bloated budgets that police departments already get. The police foundations raise funds from corporations like Coca-Cola and Bank of America and AT&T, right, to fund the purchasing of military weapons, to fund tactical trainings, to fund these trips to Israel, and now to fund the development and creation of cop cities across the country. That doesn't happen without the initial support of philanthropy in the beginning as a way of, again, counterinsurgency to make sure that bourgeois dictatorship, bourgeois dominance is still the lay of the land. And so as we move, they kill everybody in the 60s and 70s, right? Imprison folks, and the strong, the deep repression against that struggle, both outside and inside of the walls, right? Because the rise of this pagan prison struggle and Orasami's Tip of the Spears is an incredible book that speaks specifically to that, right? And he makes the argument that what happens inside of prisons ends up what happens to us outside here in the streets, right? And the centrality of prisons, especially at that time. Those independent political organizations, revolutionary parties, revolutionary organizations are all but destroyed, right? And then you move into this era where nonprofit organizations really start to kick up. So the Acorns, for those folks who remember Acorn, right? Who are taking on this Alinsky model of organizing, which means that, right, Saul Alinsky, who's credited as being the godfather of community organizing, on this, his whole thing and Alinsky organizing was that the organizer is the central figure in all of this, right? The organizer is the one who builds organizations, who looks for leaders. But the main component is that the organizer is also free of ideology. Don't get caught up in ideological stuff around decolonization, communism, and socialism, right? It's about bread and butter issues. It's about housing. It's about jobs. It's about that sort of thing. Stay away from all of that other stuff. And so we move into the organizations that we have today. And so you're talking about the last 10 years, and I'm going on this super long historical run.
No, I appreciate the background. I think that's important for folks. Yeah.
Yeah. But it's important to connect the economy, right, to what we see, because all of it is connected, right? The economy, the forces at play, in whose interests are all these decisions being made, right? Dialectical historical materialism, in whose interests are all these things play, and how do all these connect? These things connect to land us where we are today, to be able to explain how we got to where we are today. And so in the last 10 years, right, what we have seen is an explosion of sorts of, or not an explosion, but the higher visibility of a particular type of nonprofit organizing, a particular nonprofit struggle. When the radical, specifically the Black radical struggle, revolutionary struggle of the 60s and the 70s is all but destroyed, and you move into the 80s with the crack epidemic, the mass incarcerations, and going into the 90s and stuff, where folks are still trying to figure out how to deal with this. You had these nonprofit organizations fill that void and fill that gap that was left behind of leadership. And so now it's nonprofit organizations who are picking up on some of the programs that the Panthers had, right? And they're taking on these roles of providing services to the community. They're taking on these roles of providing that leadership, right? And taking the reins of the social justice movements for the community where these organizations fell off and where they were cut off, right? What they do is they also pick up the mantle where the state intentionally drops off. It is the state, it is the government through our taxes that should be providing housing, should be providing food, should be providing education, should be with the amount of money that and the wealth that the country has made, that all of these things should be free for every citizen here in the United States, but it's not, right? And essentially left to these institutions like nonprofit organizations to fill in and pick up the slack where the government has fell off. And this is where you create this sort of dependency on these organizations, because where else are you going to get it? The federal government isn't going to do it. This also allows for the organizations to be seen as somewhat radical, seen as somewhat revolutionary, because you are doing what the government does, right? And you position yourself in this sort of like moral stature, and this pedestal as being for the people, right? And so when you fast forward and you move all the way up, we land at the situation where you have Occupy Wall Street busts on the scene, right? You had the Arab Spring, and Bevins talks about this in his book, right? There's the Arab Spring that pops off, these mass mobilizations, these nonviolent revolutions that are able to topple governments and all that. And then Occupy lands in New York City, right? And folks like, we can do that here. We can take back the country. We can take what is rightfully ours. We're putting on the table the economic reality under capitalism here in this country, the 99% versus the 1%, right? And we're going to go. What we also don't need authoritarian organizations. We don't need hierarchy. We don't need organization, period. We just need a lot of folks who just want to get out there and feel so moved and take to the streets, take up space, direct action our way to liberation. Trayvon Martin gets killed. You have organizations that are popping up around that. And then 2014 is Ferguson. Ferguson bursts on the scene. We have this militarized police, like I said, who are funded through these foundations, right? These police foundations bust on the scene. And folks are like, holy cow, there's a fight back. And then with the advent of social media, with the mass media and all that, Ferguson is positioned as the revolution has arrived. We've seen this before. We saw it in Watts. We saw it in LA. We've seen it, but with social media and all this stuff, right? This was like, no, whoa, this is something completely different. This is new. With that is the proliferation of all these organizations that are specifically working on this issue of police murder, of Black people, of Black lives, and then what was later reappropriated as a Black liberation struggle and a Black liberation movement. What these nonprofit organizations and the nonprofit structure does very well is also appropriate history, take figures, take slogans, repackage it and sell it back to you, because the government isn't doing it. Again, these are the organizations who are providing you your services, who are providing you the support, your legal, who are fighting on your behalf. And so then it only makes sense that they pick up that mantle and position themselves as the Black liberation movement. And so what we saw in the last 10 years was, on one end, right, the positive component, because all wasn't bad. The positive component was the elevation of the reality of white supremacy and the racial dynamics, right, that sit at the foundation of this country. A country that is built on Black bodies, on Black stolen wealth and stolen labor, is built on the genocide of indigenous people, is built on the backs of those indentured servants who were coming from different parts of Europe, and the Chinese who built the railroads, right? Everyone and their mother literally has been screwed over by the robber barons and the ruling class elite of this country to build the country that we have today. That was put on the table in a way that was meeting and was really being resonated with a wide spectrum of folks, much wider than a lot of the more overt Marxist, overt revolutionary messaging that was happening before, because it was packaged in a way where it had the rhetoric and the sloganeering of that time, right? But still packaged in services, packaged in these very digestible and easy things that didn't require you to risk much. You didn't have to risk your life. Regardless of what they would say, you didn't have to risk your life. At most, you'd get trolled on Twitter, right? You didn't have to really sacrifice much. If anything, what you could do is get a job, right? What you
Right.
could do is get employment. What you could do is get a position that was paying you more than working at a Waffle House or at Wendy's, right? Because right now, I believe the report said 59% of nonprofit workers are making $75,000 and up. Now, the overwhelming majority of workers, up to like, I think 75% of the workers, are white folks. But, right, for the folks who are in these neighborhoods, in these cities, who are making crap working at Wendy's and Waffle House and all this place, yeah, I can come work over here. And I also have insurance, right? I also have, I can pay rent. Yeah, I'm going to do this. When all that is popping off and folks like the revolution has arrived again, Ferguson has shown us this is right. This is the way. Philanthropy in their counterinsurgent right role is like, oh crap, what can we do? Well, let's do what we did to Ocean Hill, Brownsville. Let's do what we did to the civil rights movement. Let's do what we did to the Black Power movement, and do that same thing. And you flood it with funding. You flood it with money. So again, what was possible in that time? What was possible was that, the plight of the realities of white supremacy and racism in this country, institutionally and interpersonally, was put on the table in ways that had never been done before. Right, the studies that were coming out around this thing, issues of like intersectionality and the roles and the ways in which women and marginalized identities were experiencing not only the consequences of capitalism, but also racism, patriarchy, misogyny. All of these things were put on the table and discussed in ways that, when I was growing up, had never been discussed. Right, there was the attempt to correct the errors of the past in terms of erasing the voices of women, right, queer identified folks, and everybody else who were behind the scenes of putting a lot of the work of these organizations that we lift up today from the 60s and the 70s and the 50s. It was putting the issue of policing and police violence on the table and on the map in ways and in our faces in ways that we had never seen before. It was allowing for new visions of a different world, a different society, right? Just being put out there in our faces that sounded cool, that sounded hype, coming out of the generation of young people who were really hype about Barack Obama and were really happy and were crying in line when they were voting for him. And then 2 months in are like, what the fuck, right? And are all pissed off at this. And now they want to take to the streets because this is all BS, right? Wonderful, wonderful, right? That cannot be denied. And I don't think anyone should ever deny those things. What came with that, though, then also came, again, the bureaucratization of social change and radicalism. Everything was then done through these nonprofit organizations. Everything was done through these nonprofit sectors and these nonprofit networks. Through the amounts of millions and millions of dollars that were pumped in, the communications machines that were coming out, right? The visibility that was happening in mass media, and also the ability to create their own and generate your own media through social media and all that, right, would drown out the voices of the traditional revolutionary organizations like the Malcolm X grassroots movement, the All African People's Party, Impedum, all these other ones, because you couldn't compete with those organizations. You just couldn't compete, especially with the hearts and minds of young people. You couldn't compete. They were out in the streets every week, the highway takeovers, all these things. You couldn't compete because of the infrastructure that was created, right? The staffing, the infrastructure, and the amount of money that was created to be able to do that, drown that out. And so now, for a whole generation of young people, maybe 2 generations of young people, you are being politicized and radicalized through a nonprofit lens, even though you don't know that. And so you're being asked, or you're being told that Asada taught me, but you're not being told exactly what it was that Asada taught you, right? Because you take Asada, but you remove her Marxist-Leninism from her politics. You take Asada, but you remove her Republic of New Africa from her, which clearly states there is no survival for Black people, New Africans in this country, and the only way we can survive is seceding. That was removed, right? You take all of these figures and you remove them and you sever them from their politic, because philanthropy is not going to pay you to overthrow them, right? They will let you tinker with the system because at the top, the ruling class has their own interclass battles, right? There's a struggle between the ruling class and the working class, but there's always interclass battles that happen. And so they will allow you to tinker and fight to move, right? To move the needle in their specific interests if you're on this side. The same way the Heritage Foundation and all those folks are trying to move the needle for their side. And so what happens is, specifically to speak specifically to this group, you end up having these nonprofits that then organize themselves into these networks, right? So if it's like, the Black Lives Matter organization that then merged into chapters all over the country, or you had the counterpart, which is like Movement for Black Lives, which is a network of, at this point, probably like hundreds of Black-led organizations around the country who are moving around a common vision and in a common direction in an attempt to, how do we organize all of these struggles into one sort of direction, into one common force, one common vision. But what you end up doing as well, seeing in this time is, and cut me off from if I'm talking too much, coming from the Occupy movement, was this hyper emphasis on horizontalism. We're a leaderless movement or leaderful movement, right? You use the names of Fannie Lou Hamer and Ella Baker and Assata Shakur and all these folks who were members of organizations, who are open Marxists and members of organizations, right? And you claim it's like, we don't need leaders. We're a leaderful movement, right? We have all these experiences. Erica Gaines at Hood Communist has a wonderful article around, right, how your experience is an analysis, that your experiences, right, are enough to sit at the table and make decisions and also give. You don't need ideology because there's this anti-intellectualism that also came, this pushback, right? It's like, oh, all those folks who just read all these books and think they're so much smarter than me or whatever, right? I have all this trauma, and my trauma and my experiences mean just as much, if not more, than whatever your silly books written by white people anyway, right? Can ever tell me, right? It was a primary focus on mobilization over organization. Put as many people out into the streets. We see this with the Palestinian struggle today. Mobilize, 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 mobilize. Mobilizations do not have the mechanisms in place to be able to pull people into struggle. They can only put people out into the streets, but there is no mechanism in place for leadership development, for further organizing, for deeper, so that when the mobilizations cease, because they will cease, they always do, right? That these people then just don't wash away as well, that they stay in the struggle. They don't do that. You saw there was the lack of class analysis and became like more of a race essentialist thing, right? This became the Black liberation movement. It reappropriated and redefined what Black liberation meant without accurately and actually having to define what Black liberation means. It became a placeholder that held a lot of different perspectives, a lot of different politics, right? It fetishized spontaneity. And so look at Ferguson and look at Minneapolis and look at, and wherever these uprisings happen, right? That's where the revolution is going to be. And we parachute in with all of our technical assistants, our communications firms, our organizing practitioners, our direct action trainers, and we can make your thing the next Ferguson, because with that comes what? Visibility, more funding, right? More resources that then go back into your community. Does all that mean to say that the folks who are running these organizations, are they CIA agents who are intentionally trying to undermine what could be the revolutionary beginnings of a real revolutionary struggle in this country? No, it doesn't. It means that there are a lot of folks who in their hearts feel they're doing what is right, but who are unfortunately politicized and educated through a nonprofit system. How you and I, we talk about how we also started in those very systems, right? What you and I had because of our age and our time was that we still had a connection to the past, right? And so those former members of the 60s and 70s, when I was a teenager, were still only like in their 50s, late 40s, 50s, and 60s. They were still around, and they were still, right, sort of like keeping you in line. There's been a disconnect, a serious disconnect between these generations and that generation. And there's a gap generation, which is ours, a Gen X generation that sits in this middle, who, and I can only speak for myself, but my political experience was listening to these folks. I joined the struggle because I wanted to martyr myself. I wanted to martyr myself, right? There was a glorification of that. If I could give my life for my country, if I could give my life for my people, that is the greatest gift I could ever give to the world, and especially to a young man who couldn't finish college, who couldn't get a job, who was feeling like I'm a loser, I'm a disappointment to my mother, I'm a disappointment to everybody. I'll probably never be nothing in my life, because that's the message that I'm getting. What is the least I could do? The least I could do is give my life to you in a Huey Newton revolutionary suicide type thing. It was Nahanda Abiodun in 2003 in Cuba who said, no, dying is easy. It's the living in the struggle part that's the hard. Living and being present in the struggle, that's the hard part. That is the thing that takes courage. That is the thing that takes. But the reality is that my generation, following that grouping, we idolized those folks. And to an extent, we were trained in that way to prepare for a war that never came. Right? We're preparing in a way, in a discipline, an organizational discipline, that you follow the leadership and you listen to your elders and all that, and you prepare for a war that never came. And so now we're 40-year-olds, 30-year-olds, right, who then became resentful. I gave, like you said, 80 hours a week to this damn job, but I'm also giving like another 80-hour, right, to free political prisoners and to do all this stuff. And that moment never came. And I got burnt out and I left. And so you have a generation of young people today, and there's a generation from the 60s and 70s who are not bridged, because there's this middle gap generation who kind of walked away and stepped back and said, I'm out. And so we can't totally blame these young people for who is politicizing them and where they're politicizing and where that took them, right? Because a lot of that responsibility ends up falling on us. And so as I'm critiquing, I also want to be fair and give a self-criticism, right, to my generation and myself, for the mistakes that we made that landed us here, right, and landed you in this situation. So to wrap all this up, what ends up happening is that when philanthropy comes in and you have all these organizations, you create these networks that then become gatekeepers. And what you have is a network of gatekeepers who had access to the funding, right, who are able to then pick and choose who are the people who are doing the authentic work, who are the people who are doing real stuff, and then funnel the monies into there. And so if you don't fall in line with that, then you could be left out, right? You could be left out of the situation. Now the nefarious folks are the folks who sit at top, who are giving the money, right? Because what we have to understand as nonprofit workers, and those of us who are watching who are nonprofit workers who are in this work, right, that the same people we say we are fighting against are the same people who are giving us money, right? The same system that we are trying to abolish and change or whatever is the same one that's feeding us, giving us insurance, giving us, right, the means to pay mortgages, the means to pay rents, and all of that. And that is the inherent contradiction in all of this. Because there's only but so far you're willing to fight. There's only but so much you're willing to say, because now you have to protect that, the careerism. I have a career now. I have a job. My kids have insurance because I work in a nonprofit organization. There are no more factories because of neoliberalism. There are no more jobs that pay you a living wage in this country unless you go work for whatever, and those keep getting taken away, right? NAFTA and globalization keeps taking people's means for survival away, where we can't afford rent, groceries, nothing today. And I have to think about that. So even as I sit on this thing and I'm talking about the foundations and nonprofits or whatever, right? I do that with the acknowledgement and in full consciousness that I could be losing and putting in jeopardy my means of survival, because they don't like you doing that, right? They don't like that. They don't like anything that can be seen as a threat to their control, their being the ruling elites, the rich of this country and of the world. And so through these networks and through these gatekeepers, you have a new generation of race managers who use identity language, who use race, right, to sort of like set the playing field. Some of them intentionally, absolutely, and some of them unintentionally because they think this is the only thing they've ever seen close to radical or revolutionary or whatever, right? I'll end with this. The biggest way that the nonprofit industrial complex has moved specifically Black radicalism and Black revolutionary struggle into a different direction has been through the electoralism. And so when there's an uprising in these cities, there's an uprising in all these communities, there's riots, there's whatever, folks jump in, they come with their technical assistance, they come with all these services, they're providing people who are just kind of like, we're here, we're ready to go. They give you the language, they give you the swag, they give you all the clothing and the things. They do that. And then what they tell you is vote, go vote. And we saw that specifically in this moment, right? In this particular period, we're talking about this BLM sort of moment that we're talking about when the elections came up and these folks told everybody, right, that the road to real significant change was going to be through this presidential election, and that Elizabeth Warren was it, right? And that was that was the calculation that Elizabeth Warren was going to be the way. Bernie's a racist. Bernie's damn near Ku Klux Klan. Forget all that other stuff, right? It's Elizabeth Warren. And then directly and indirectly had all of their followers also turn against Bernie when then it became like a Bernie Biden sort of thing or whatever. And here we are with Sleepy Joe doing what Sleepy Joe does. Not that Bernie Sanders is anything, right? But it's through that electoralism that they're always going to ask you to vote harder. Vote harder. The most important election of our time. We're voting targets. We're not voting friends, right? That this is harm reduction. That once we vote them in, we're going to hold them accountable. And then you never hold them accountable. You do not have the power. We do not have the power to hold a sitting president accountable, right? You win the demands that you're organized to take, right? I don't know whose quote that is. I heard Claudia de la Cruz say it, right? But like you win the demands that you're organized to take, and we're not organized. We're not organized. Right? I'll stop there because I was talking a whole lot. I know you have questions, but
no, absolutely. Thank you for all of that. As someone in the chat said, let him cook when you asked earlier on. But there's a couple things that you touch on that I want to pull out a little bit more. I mean, one, I'll just say from my perspective that part of the discussion or part of the problem with the discussion around accountability is that many nonprofits, this depends on what level you're working on, but especially a lot of times, nonprofits in cities, they develop a clientelistic relationship with the state. And they develop a clientelistic relationship with a particular administration, especially if it's a democratic administration. What I mean by that is that the city funds programs of theirs. And so it is not possible, aside from, you saying some, maybe choice words behind closed doors to somebody. There's no mechanism for accountability there, because your organization and staff and so on are now dependent upon you having a clientelistic relationship with that administration. And so that's one thing I'm always super wary of, especially when you see these cycles that we've seen of mobilization, often related to police, police killings, things like this, right? And you start to see this influx, people supporting these organizations locally. They pivot to the electoral side on a local level. Maybe they have some success there in getting somebody elected. Maybe it's not even, Philadelphia, it's like, it may not even be the person that you want, but still, how critical are you going to be of the sitting Democratic mayor if they're still going to be providing you with some funding? And obviously that's different. That's a specific instance, but it happens a lot. It's a real issue. So there's that. And maybe you'll say something about that. I don't know. The other thing that I do want to bring out too is I think that we also have to be self-critical and talk a little bit about management, because within the nonprofits, like you said, there's true believers, there's people who are doing the best they can with the things that they have, and or that's the way that the story they tell themselves, at least,
Right.
and we all have to eat, like, so it's not like we're not bad mouthing people who work for nonprofits and things like that. I know you do. You know, I have for 15 years. I don't currently. But uh, the thing that I want to say is that some of the leadership of some of these nonprofits, they'll also come out of more radical movements, or, you know, of grassroots movements, and, you know, then enter these spaces. And I wonder if you have thoughts on, you know, I guess there's two ways you could come out. You could come out and turn your back, right? And say those people were wrong. They didn't know what they were doing. They didn't have resources. That's not going to work. There's not enough, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
You could also come out of it and say, you know, work with those organizations and still try to have some type of positive relationship, and maybe even help funnel some people in that direction, but recognizing that resources are also, you know, can be a tool.
Yeah.
So yeah, I realize I laid out two completely different things, but I'm
But
interested in how you're thinking about that.
they link, right? They link because there is, so as a nonprofit director, right, and speaking as a nonprofit director of two separate organizations, I had to think in a number of ways. One, you have to maintain the organization because you have people whose livelihoods depend on being paid, right? And so you have to get funding to run this organization, to be able to pay your folks. The existence of our organizations, as Dylan Rodriguez wrote way back in the book, The Revolution Will Not Be Funded, right? The existence of these organizations depends on professional grant writers, not organizers, right? It's how good can you write these grants really, and word what you're doing, and the relationships that you have with the funders that's going to dictate whether you get funded or not so much too much of what's happening on the actual ground, right? And I can I can talk more about that later. But you also have to make a decision. Do I accept funding from the city and enter this clientele sort of relationship, or do I not? Because the city is the target, right? And if I take their money, then I can't do that. And so you have service providing organizations, after school programs, that sort of thing, that do take city funding because they're not in the business of organizing and raging against the machine. Those of us who are on the social change side of things, right, then have to say, what's going to be the cost? What's going to be limitations of me taking that? There's limitations to everything. There's strings attached with every dollar that you get from, say the only ones don't come with strings attached really are the individual donations. And that's only up to a certain point, because folks who donate 5,000 and up want to tell you everything. They want to be involved in all kinds of stuff. And so part of that is then deciding, is the regime, the administration in office at the local level, the state level, the federal level, are they my targets, right? Or are they, at the very least, folks who we can win concessions from? They're never your friends, right? But are the conditions there where you can win some significant reforms and significant concessions from? And then you make your decisions based off that. Also, what type of campaigns that you're going to run based off what is their winnability. This is go back to the Alinsky thing, right? Their winnability, because you also need to demonstrate something for this funding. So it's not just nothing, it's just grants. You have to win something, but that winning gives you visibility, notoriety, that puts you in the rooms with folks to get more funding, right? It's all market-based stuff. These are commodities. You're selling something in order to be paid back, right? Academics who rage against the machine, against nonprofits, and those nonprofits, and those or whatever, right? Why say nothing about the ivory towers they work in and the academic institutions that are equally complicit in all this, right? They also have to produce. They got to write their little books. They got to write their journals. They could write, everything is sell here in this country. And so for nonprofits, it's that thing. What are you selling? What is the thing that you're selling back to the foundation for them to pay for that? And you have to understand like that. Most folks in the nonprofit don't look at, but that's exactly what it is, because we live in this country. And when you understand it that way, right, things become much more clearer. And so to the point, your second point, the second question that you were, if I get it correct, was, repeat it again.
Well, it's just basically like, you said a little bit about this, but There's the layer of management. There's the layer of executive directors or leadership within the nonprofits that
Yeah,
crop up around Ferguson and
yeah,
in that general era. And some of them come out
yeah.
of revolutionary movements or mass organizations
Right, right,
associated
right,
with
right, right.
revolutionary movements.
Yeah.
And I think there's kind of different trajectories in which someone can come out of that.
Hmm.
Um, but I wondered if you could say a little bit about
It's
how
a
that
lot of them.
dynamic. Yeah.
It's a lot of them, right? This is why I say that these folks are not all CIA agents. They're not all folks who are intentionally trying to like be some sort of, black misleadership class or intentionally trying to do. They have found themselves in these positions, right? Where I think some of them tell themselves that what they're doing is an evolution of what they were trying to do before when they were younger, right? I think there's some that have become disillusioned. The majority of them have become disillusioned, right, by the failures of their organizations, right, at the time that wasn't doing enough. Case in point, I remember the Malcolm X grassroots movement when Ferguson popped off. Right, we all watched it on TV, and like I said, mainstream media and folks were like, this is the revolution. This is it. We've never seen nothing like this before. Holy cow! Ferguson is Moscow 1917. This is the greatest time of our lives, right? But there are those of us who are kind of like, no, it's not. Right? This is a spontaneous eruption that happens and is always going to happen throughout the time. The organization sat that, right, with the Black Lives Matter moment at the time. The organization MXGM sat that out on the sidelines. They were like, we don't know what this is, right? There's this influx of these nonprofit organizations. There's this whole thing claimed to be Black liberation movement, but it is not what we understand Black liberation movement to be or revolutionary struggle to be. Those of us who are members of the organization, there was a lot of us who are in nonprofit organizations, were stuck in the middle of our organizations have to respond to this moment because the funders are saying, what are you doing about this? What is your organization's connection in Philadelphia to what is happening in St. Louis? Right? Because now they're creating funding streams, right? And the way funding works is that the heads of the foundations at the top, they'll go through their field scans, they go through their studies, they go through whatever, and they come out and every couple of years they say, here is what we're funding. Here's the priorities of the foundation. The priorities of the foundation are A, B, C, D, right? And now basically what that is a bat signal to the nonprofit organizations is you all better be working on A, B, C, D if you want to get this funding. So then the work on the ground starts to look like A, B, C, D, right? And so the organization sits out. So like on one end, we have this responsibility or this thing we have to like, and it was a time. I'm not gonna lie, right? It was a time. And folks were like, yo, this is a moment, right? We have to take advantage of this moment and really push them. And folks did and push it all the way. And we're very grateful that they did for all the reasons that I said before. But the organization was like, but that's not revolutionary struggle. That's some nonprofit stuff. That's something else. We don't want to be too tied in there, right? We get sent as MXGM members, get sent to Ferguson to provide trainings around our understanding of revolutionary struggle to specific organizations in which were the traditional radical organizations in St. Louis, not so much the nonprofits that popped up, but the traditional like the organization of Black struggle and stuff like that, right? Around Black liberation in the New African sense, right? This moment can be used to organize folks around that. You're running up against into the nonprofit piece. Because the organization sat down, you had a lot of members who left and went into this nonprofit approach. A lot of the leaders of your organizations, right, that we know today, from the highest levels of electoralism to the highest levels of nonprofits, come out as original members of the Malcolm X grassroots movement, who identified and identify as New Africans, who understand the politic. You have folks at the highest levels, right? You had Patrisse Cullors who said, I'm a trained Marxist. Folks who came out of the organizations in California, Marxist organizations, right? All these groups. You have a lot of folks who are trained and who, for all intents and purposes, knew better or should have known better, but seized the moment where a lot of the elders from the time were like, man, that's nonprofit stuff. We're going to stay out of that. Missed the opportunity because it was the zeitgeist. It had captured the zeitgeist. It had captured the hearts and minds of every young person, everybody in the country. So there's no way you can sit that out. But they did. And so the young people from those organizations, well, I'm not going to sit this out. Your assessment of this moment is wrong, and jumped in. And once you're in, now you're leading a lot of stuff, and if you're doing stuff, and to their point, have won reforms in these last 10 years, all kinds of reforms, all kinds of stuff, right? It's not like things have not been won. Things have absolutely been won. The problem is with nonprofit work and nonprofit struggle and reform and policy change is that they're always subject to the whims of the administration that's in office. And those things can always be rolled back, and they will be rolled back. And then you have to fight and win them again and try to defend them, and then they roll them back. So when philanthropy tells us, right, that coming out of that time, like, all right, the struggle, the funding is going to be for consent decrees and body cameras, because we need to see what's right. The whole rage with the body cameras at the time, everyone is pushing for body cameras, right? Everyone's pushing for body cameras. Body cameras don't work. The foundations then are like, no, it's not body cameras. Let's do this other thing, which at the time started to become invest, divest, what was known as invest, divest. Because the folks on the ground, very smart people with a political understanding. These folks are not dumb, and they're not, regardless of what you may hear, some sort of like nefarious CIA right-wing robots, right? I truly believe that a lot of them genuinely feel they're doing the right thing, and they're being strategic within the context that exists. They're no longer as many or very, very few revolutionary organizations, revolutionary parties for them to be a part of. What do you do when a moment like this arises and those groups are either so outdated that they're still running, still being run by very old folks who didn't understand leadership development and ageism and never brought in younger people, which is why my generation just kicked rocks, right? Or they don't have a clear assessment of what is happening because they're not on the ground just because of nature of work and age or whatever. So they can't really accurately assess where young people are at, right? Or they're just not relevant. Their organizations are just not relevant around the country and in their communities. Where else am I going to go? Right? And if it doesn't exist, well, then let me create it. And that's what they did. And so then you do this and you're running these things. And so invest divest comes on, where through that analysis of capitalism, through that analysis of the economy, was like, look, these police departments have these inflated, right? These inflated budgets. How do we take money from that, right? Divest from policing and invest back into what the folks actually need: housing, education, food sustainability, right? Healthcare, free health, all of those things, because the money is there. This isn't new, right? Dr. King's Poor People's Market, right? Like, people always understood the money is there. It's just controlled by a small few. This is the beginnings of the abolition, the rise, right, of abolition movement, how we know it today. The abolition struggle has always been, since critical resistance creation, I think maybe like 30 years ago at this point, something like that, right? Has always existed for the longest time, but then it finds this resurgence in the nonprofit through the invest divest movement. So when we said no more consent decrees and no more whatever, now it was about alternatives to policing, safety alternatives to policing that would come by way of divesting from the police and reinvesting into the communities. Foundations started to get on board. And when the big foundations say, this is what we fund and these are our priority areas, all the smaller foundations then follow suit. This is how you're able to amass so much money for specific issues, right? There are foundations, be they Ford, be they open societies, be they whatever, that sit at the very top and sort of set the agenda for everybody else, right? So they're like, okay, the funding is for invest, divest. All the work moves away from those things and now jumps into invest, divest. So by the time you get to 2019, now all the rage is invest, divest. That thing gets reframed as defund. It becomes an easier slogan. Again, your communications firms, your expertise is all that. Defund, put out there as defund, 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 and defund campaigns all over the country, right? So again, to answer your point, that because of the failures of the revolutionary organizations, the absence of revolutionary organizations, their inability for leadership development, their inability to assess the moment in real time, created a vacuum and a void that these folks who were on board up to that point then decided we have to ride this, we have to jump in this, we can't just ignore what is happening, and rightfully so. But unfortunately, it happens through this nonprofit structure, which is counterinsurgent from its inception. And so through their fellowships, through their leadership developments, through the relationships that now you have with foundations, because now you're responsible for $40 million. For folks who don't know, it is extremely difficult to spend $1 million.
Yep.
Unless you're buying Bugattis and chains or whatever, it is extremely difficult to spend $1 million. And that money is earmarked. Now you can use that money and push the boundaries of the nonprofit industrial complex. And a lot of organizations do that. You can take those resources and reallocate them and move them to have real programs and real projects in place that push the limitations of the nonprofit industrial complex as far as they can go. That is an absolutely real thing, and it happens every day. What you have to realize is that you will hit a wall, though. There's only but so far. And the mistake that was made during this time was that these organizations were allowed to think of themselves, promote themselves, and move as if they are revolutionary organizations. And they're not, and they never will be. And I'm starting with the organizations that I've run and that I've founded. They are not, and they never will be, due to the confines of the nonprofit status. And if you understand it and you're clear about that, then you're careful with your language and you're careful with the way you move. One thing that we never did at PSU and definitely don't do at the hub was use the names of the dead to raise money. Say her name, say their names were important in helping the average, John and Jane Doe public understand the very real violence of policing in this country. What it also did, though, was allow folks to use those names to raise funding for their organizations because, look, we're doing this work. That becomes a very tricky thing because what you ended up having in this moment was an influx of academics, influx of professionals, grad students into the nonprofit structure. So as you talk about these revolutionaries, yeah, you had, or folks who were part of revolutionary organizations, you have that, but you also have folks coming out of the housing crisis, right, of like 2012 and all that, in academia that turns everyone into an adjunct professor and doesn't grant tenure to anyone, who are now finding minimum $75,000 gigs in nonprofit, and so they come and they all jump in there. Right, and it's the professionalization of the nonprofit industrial complex. So it loses its revolutionary. So whatever these folks had, what we assume of their knowledge, is now supplanted by a whole influx of professionals who are thinking career first, but are also trained in bourgeois institutions, right? Mentored, because these organizations also have these mentors of these professors, right? Specific professors and so-called socialists who sat out the turbulent times of their generations, went and got doctorate degrees, wrote a bunch of books or whatever, and have resurfaced, right, as ex-CP USA folks coming out of a type of Marxism that is this sort of like anti-Soviet Union, the post the fall of the Soviet Union, right, and leans more Black radical tradition, leans more Cedric Robinson, leans more, right, Marx and Engels. Those are just white guys. They don't really understand, right? The Black right is something different. And so you have that. And so what is being proposed and spouted as anti-capitalist and some semblance of socialism is really like this dem sock watered down revisionism that comes by way of academia, that comes by way of these mentors and these professionals to give the illusion of revolutionary posturing. But really, it's petty bourgeois at best liberalism or radical progressivism that relies heavily on electoral politics, right? And reformist policy changes. That was a whole lot. I don't know if that answered your question, but
no, that was great. That was exactly what I wanted you to talk about.
Okay.
Yeah, I have two things, but let's get to the defund and talk about that a little bit
Yeah, yeah.
more. Because you have a lot of experience working, obviously, because of the work that you do at Community Resource Hub, of working to support and connect work around the country of folks who've been engaged in these struggles. So talk a little bit about what you have, thought of in terms of some of the lessons from those efforts. Um, and, you've already talked about how it kind of became popularized as a demand, so I don't think we need to rehash that, but just talk a little bit about some of the things you take away from it all.
Yeah. The contradictions of capitalism continue to get sharper and sharper as time goes on. We can't afford rent. We can't afford housing. More and more people are seeing that, right? And I think since Occupy Wall Street, folks' understanding or attention to the economy has been sharpened, and so we credit these moments in time, and also give credit to this sort of like BLM and for BL moment for also carrying that torch and continue to do that. So we credit that, and so we recognize is that we can't afford anything. And more people are recognizing that. And people are recognizing there's something up with this, with this policing stuff. We can't tell the difference between soldiers and cops anymore, right? Folks are being killed continuously because of social media. So you see it. It's one thing to hear of something happening in those ghettos of people who I don't see, who I don't know. It's another thing to see them and actually see them on TV that has resonated with people in a very different way, that has rocked their understanding of what this is. And so what we saw with the defund campaigns was that there were incredible moments for politicization and radicalizing of common citizens, right? Asking the question, what does your ideal neighborhood look like? What does your ideal school look like? What does your ideal city look like? And folks will tell you books and air conditioning and beautiful walls and gardens and parks and affordable this, and there's enough parking and there's enough space or whatever. Where does the money for that come from? Well, there's no money for it. And then you point to the police, right? And they're like, what the hell? And so getting folks to understand the importance of the economy and understand the forces at play and in whose interest these budgets are being put into, because ultimately police only exist to serve capital, right? To protect private property. Private property being, as Marx and Engels teach us, right? Private property are those resources, those things from which we get profit from, right? It's not your personal property. It's not the house that you live in. It's the house that you rent, right? They protect these things. And so then folks are now looking at policing, looking at mass incarceration, looking at safety in a very different light. In some places in Seattle, Washington, I think St. Louis to an extent. There are different cities around the country who have Milwaukee in 2019 were able to pull some of that funding away from policing and redirect it back into services. Again, we live under a bourgeois dictatorship, and so there's only but so much that the capitalist regime is going to give you. But they were able to do that, and were able to win that, right? They were able to put pressure on elected officials who traditionally and for so long have ignored certain sectors of the population, have ignored Black people as a whole, have ignored the poor or whatever, and put them right on call to be like, what are you doing with this funding? Where are your priorities being met? A slew of alternatives have come out of this defund fight and under the guise and under the umbrella of abolition, right? Alternative safety. So it is the violence interruption programs that exist. It is the pulling mental health, right? Mental health calls to 911 away from police and into trained professionals who can deal with folks who are suffering mental health crises instead of sending officers who only know how to kill people. It's looking at removing policing from reproductive sex. It's looking at the reality that the carceral institutions and policing doesn't just begin and end with uniformed officers, but it also includes your welfare office. It includes the Department of Children and Families. It includes foster care. All of these are policing. All of this is a part of the carceral apparatus, right? And these struggles have elevated that and put that on the table. And so there are projects being run across the country, thousands of them, trying to figure out, right, what is the way that's going to work to move us off of this this reliance on policing that the state has, right? And find alternative ways where we, right, the phrase "we keep us safe," where we as community members can fill in that gap without having to call those folks. Those are some of the wins and the benefits that have come out of that moment. What we have learned from this as well, though, is that folks don't know how to organize. And so the overwhelming majority of these campaigns to run around defund end up getting their butts kicked at the city hall level because they don't know how to run campaigns. They don't know how to run organizing campaigns. You have 10 years of a movement, a moment that has relied primarily on mobilizations and sloganeering, right? That what ended up happening was a severing, right? There's a disconnect that's happening between the nonprofit practitioners and the community themselves. And in that, with all of the stuff that this brought with it in terms of its identity reductionism, the traumas, the highlighting experience, I mean, you know, your personal experience over, right, knowledge and that sort of thing, they're generated what my friend Lex referred to this class contempt, even within that circle, even within the Black struggle. You had a lot of folks, Black people in the community, I can speak here in Philadelphia, who saw these Black movements as hating Black people, right? They hate poor Black people. They speak to a specific milieu of Black people, a specific type of Black excellence. There's a specific type of Black leadership. There's a specific type of Black person who we are looking for. It's not these everyday. Now, we will call your names when you're dead. We will call your names when you're shot. We will do all that, right? But we are not going to create pipelines in which you can be leaders. So for all of the romanticization of spontaneity and tailism, which comes from the horizontalism and the heavy anarcho influences, right, in all of this stuff, it only goes but up to a certain point. Because philanthropy and those folks also don't care about poor people, especially not poor Black people. And so you have a disconnect that exists between the nonprofit movements and the actual people on the ground. And so when we're working here in Philadelphia and doing the work in Philadelphia, you know, the young man, we have Sherelle Parker, who's the first Black mayor in Philadelphia, which is a thing, right? And it's like trust everybody Black and trust all these slogans that have been proven to be wrong, right? Trust all Black women and trust everybody and all this stuff. And then all the other ethnicities, right, copying that. Be they Latino communities, be they Asian communities, right? Copying, because that's kind of like how it happens. So it's not to just put all this on Black struggle and Black organizations. They all do it. Everybody does it, right? She reinstitutes stop and frisk. We have our first stop and frisk murder last week, right? And sorry about that. I don't know, and Zoom does this weird thing now. Of the young man Spencer, right, who is shot in a stop and frisk thing. We'll take the streets and we can go and can be like end stop and frisk. End stop and frisk is racist. It does more harm than it catches anybody. But how do you articulate that to the people in Philadelphia, right? And the neighborhood people who are living in the neighborhoods with the very real reality that yes, folks are shooting each other. Yes, they are stealing your Kia with a cell phone charger. Yes, right, there's drugs being sold. Yes, there are a lot of guns in your neighborhoods, and yes, that does exist. But get rid of the police and stop these stop and frisks, because what they're going to tell you is like, well, the police went in there and he had an illegal gun, right? These are the difficult conversations that you have to have with your community if you are truly an organizer and not an activist. And there's too many activists who are claiming to be organizers and who don't understand the science of organizing, who only speak to the already converted, which is what this movement also did. It only spoke to the already converted and didn't have time to engage with you who didn't have the right language, who didn't have the right framework, who didn't have the right, who maybe had reactionary thoughts and thinkings. But what else are you going to expect from us in this capitalist society, right? If it's not going to be an incredible amount of reactionary thoughts and thinkings and socializations that you have to work through and peel back slowly with the people. And so you have to listen to them when they say, Yeah, I get it, but screw all your abolition stuff. Screw all that, because I'm tired of these young men right here. And I'll point to all of them, right, who are shooting up the neighborhood every other weekend. And you have to work with the people through that, right? And that wasn't happening because those people also don't vote. And so when the DNC, through their different acolytes and their different institutions, right, the Democrats are saying, we need you to get out and vote, get these people out to vote, right? You're looking at a different group of people than those who probably can't because of legal reasons, or who just don't because of their class position or their declassed position. And that's coming through labor, right? When I was at PSU, we turned down $40,000 from the SEIU to do voter registration stuff. I'm working with high school students 14 to 19 years old. The SEIU approaches us in this sort of community labor partnership to say, hey, we can pay you $40,000. You can give stipends to young people to go register to vote and basically vote Democrat. I think it was, who was it? Might have been Hillary at the time. If not Hillary, then it was like Biden or something. I think it was Hillary, right? And we said no. I don't engage in electoralism. I recognize that it is not. Is there usefulness to it? There's some usefulness to it strategically. There is. I'm not going to deny that. That's just not our work, and we don't want to be beholden to the SEIU. Because the same way you said beholden to the city when they give you money, you're also beholden to whoever gives you that money. And at that time, the SEIU was in the process of labor imperialism in Puerto Rico, breaking up the Puerto Rico Teachers Union, right? So that the AFT and those folks, they can take those workers. And so as the SEIU is sitting here, it's like, oh yeah, we're fighting and we're doing this for the working people. You're in my country, right? Busting up unions and breaking them up so that you can enact your own labor imperialism in my country. No, I'm not taking your $40,000. Do we need the $40,000? Absolutely need that $40,000. But you have to make these strategic decisions, because by not accepting that money also means that now you have beef with the SEIU. You have beef with whoever, because almost like a mafia type thing, right? You didn't accept this? Gotcha. We're not going to show up to your actions. We're not going to support your campaigns, right? Because of XYZ. And so the lessons from that, the biggest one has been that folks don't know how to organize. They only know how to mobilize and utilize direct actions up to a certain point. And we see this a lot with the Palestinian struggle now, where it's just hit the streets every week, every day, just keep hitting the streets, have these symbolic direct actions that don't really like shut down a lot of stuff, but they become, it's symbolism, it's virtue signaling, it's right, it's demonstrating. But we also don't know. You have a generation of folks who don't know what else to do, because they've been trained through these last 10 years of that's how you do it, taking highways and blocking this and creating mass mobilizations. And from that, you'll have those who get picked off and become the celebrities and anointed the leaders of that movement. And then what will they do? Well, they'll get mortgages and write books and then go move on and do something else. And then you're just right back to where you started. And so the creation of the George Jackson School through our job was specifically to address that, right? It's to address that. It's like taking folks who are in these nonprofit organizations, specifically in these nonprofit organizations, the new organizers, the ones who just stepped in like you and I did when we were young, right? And say two things. Here is how you organize. Organizing is a science. It has taken me 20 years to be able to be like, I can do this well, right? It is a science. Here's the steps, and here's how you do this from point A to point B. But also here's the political education to understand the reality of our situation, that our organizations are not revolutionary organizations. Our organizations can only be pushed but so far. But we operate within a counterinsurgent context. And therefore, our organizations also partake in a certain level of counterinsurgency, even to the best of our abilities, starting with me, right? Who's on this, telling you this stuff, right? Even to the best of our abilities, there's just no way around that. What are you going to do to balance that? And so then we look to George Jackson, right? We look to Comrade George, specifically for his understanding of the importance of study and analysis. looking at the economic forces at play, the social forces at play, the political forces at play, right? How are all those things working in unison and in whose interest to create the context that we're operating in today? And then therefore that will tell us, how do we get out? Organizational discipline. Get off Twitter. Stop attacking each other. Stop fighting over funding money that's not even ours, money that is stolen from us, money that is from stolen labor, money that comes off the backs of poor people and children in Africa and Asia and Southeast Asia, and goes to the pockets of these mega billionaires who create these foundations, who then give us funding. Right? Don't fall into the liberalism and individualism that we are taught in this country and wrap it in this opportunism, like Lenin says in State and Revolution, right? Of using slogans and heroes of the past to push forth your opportunist BS. And then the importance of revolutionary organizations. That if we're going to change this system, and Comrade George was very clear that in order to change the system, you must change the relations to the property relations. Engels and Marx say this in the manifesto. It's a State and Revolution. It's in everywhere. Capitalism has to go. There is no reforming this thing. It's not going to be you abolish the police and everything else falls. It's all of it. In order to raise the revolutionary consciousness of the people who are working, the poor working people who are so disillusioned, but who are also so brainwashed or whatever, you have to meet them where they're at. You have to start at their material condition, not feeding them idealism, not feeding them a different type of hope and change and visions that come from, fiction books and Octavia Butler and all kinds of imaginations and blah, 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 blah. No. The lessons have already been there, from Africa to China to Cuba to Watts to Detroit, Michigan. Right? Don't fall into this thing that these bourgeois illusion, the institutions, through their philanthropies, through their democratic parties, right, are feeding you and sending us off into some whirlwind of idealism. Comrade George teaches us to be materials, analyze the conditions, recognize the futility of all these tools, exhaust them to their very ends. Malcolm said this as well in Battle of the Bullet, right? Of elections, of your service providers, of your school systems, of your universities, exhaust every and all means. And when you get to that point, there's only one thing that's left to be done. It's revolution. And this has to go. And your nonprofit is not going to prepare folks for revolution, because revolution is violence. Revolution is violence. George says it. I have the book. I can't find the quote right now, right? But we're dealing with an enemy who is so organized and so committed. Orasami talks about this in Tip of the Spear as well. So committed to their project and to destroying us that they will do anything and everything to stop it, if it means taking us all to hell with them. He teaches us a certain level of urgency that comes from George Jackson. As a man who was writing his blood in my eye, understanding that he was going to die, with the full knowledge that he was going to die, and said, we don't have time to wait for folks to get it. And some of the folks that he was specifically talking about was like the masses of liberal white folks. So we don't have time for folks to get it. Those of us who are on the board have to organize ourselves and start preparing for this fight. Because by the time we wait for them to get it, what is going to be left? He says it, a desert. What is going to be left? We're in an era, my kids grew up in an era where the United States military is blowing complete countries off the map. Syria, Yemen, Iraq, what is happening in Gaza. Blowing them off the map. And adding more and more Somalia, right? Adding more and more to the list as it goes on. Completely starving and sucking out the Sudan and the Congo. Bangladesh, right? Like, what is going to be left if we keep waiting? The only vehicles that can do that are revolutionary organization. It takes revolutionary party. You may not agree with that, and that is fine. We follow George. George said, is the Revolutionary Party, is a revolutionary organization that can do that. In this era of anti-Marxism, right, intellectual anti-Marxism, that becomes tricky when you're butting up against this nonprofit industrial complex that has also given way to a certain level of idealism, specifically around this issue of abolition, right, that allows for either these anti-Soviet so-called Marxists, revisionists, right, anarchos, libertarians, and any and every other group, right, who falls in line with the narrative from the United States government, right, that Marxism and those specifically revolutionary organizations, revolutionary parties are the supreme evil that have to be fought against. And history has taught us those are the only ones that have ever defeated this monster. In Vietnam, in Cuba, right, in Cape Verde, in Angola, the list goes on and on and on. It is a paper tiger. It is a paper tiger that is being torn to shreds in Gaza. It is a paper tiger that will die in Lebanon. It is a paper tiger that will die in the deserts, right, in the sands of that part of the world. It will die in Asia. It will die in Africa. It will die in Latin America. And it's grasping. And in this country, it's using these nonprofit structures that I am a part of, institutions, to continue to sell that to us. So now when the elections come around, it's going to rely on these folks who position themselves to be revolutionaries to get us to vote for Joe Biden again, because we can't have another era of Donald Trump, right? It always goes back to that, to maintain bourgeois control. And so those of you who are listening, and those of you who sit with me in this nonprofit industrial complex, we must understand that something else needs to happen. Something else needs to be created. So through our George Jackson School, this is what we're showing folks. Yeah, it'll probably never get funded after they see this. Oh, this is what you're doing in there, right? But it is to show Comrade George has shown us. And it's not just George, it's plenty of folks, right? But who have shown us the path. The thing with George is that there's that violence piece. Aside from his identity in this moment in time where identity is so crucial, important, right? But it's the violence piece. But all we experience is violence. Defunding your schools is violence. Closing schools down is violence. Making food unaffordable is violence. Having to go into bankruptcy and debt because you went to the hospital is violence. You make us sick and then kill us with debt when we try to get in your house. That's violence. Everything we experience across class lines, across racial demographics, across gender and all of it is violence. All we experience is violence. And Frantz Fanon, right? Frantz Fanon says it. Violence will only yield to greater violence. I don't make the rules. I don't make the rules. Right? And so that's that thing. And so find who your person is. And let's say you don't agree, be you anarcho, be you a Marxist, be you whoever. Find the folks who you look up to and read who they read. Study who they study. This is the other thing we get from the opening passages from George. He says Mao, Engels, right? Lenin redeemed me. As a young man who went into prison, a petty criminal, right? Understood the reality of not only his class position, but the state of Black people as a colony in this country, and then a state of just all oppressed people in the world, regardless of race and nationality, through study, and then applied that study with practice. No one is saying be obsessed and follow to the T every word that these individuals said back in 1960. No. But there was a blood sacrifice that was made for us that should be respected and should be honored. To learn from, study, and then apply to our conditions, adapt and apply to our conditions. If you are an anarchist, fine, then read the canon Read those folks who came before. Study study, right? And then reassess and apply your tactics, right, to what you believe. But we can't allow the state and this state to tell us that those people don't matter anymore, that those books don't matter, that you don't need to listen to that, that that's just white people bullshit, that that's all, because it's not. It includes Fidel, it includes Sankara, it includes Cabral, it includes Mao, Mariátegui, El Che Guevara, Nkrumah. The list goes on and on. You're not just talking about, one individual. Queen Mother Moore. Right? The Queen Mother, you want to talk about abolition and police struggles, but within a Marxist context and all that, what I'm saying? There's plenty of famous academics who write books about that. And then there's Queen Mother Moore, who lived it and who built revolutionary organization around that. There's a difference. The same Queen Mother Moore who also mentored, right, our beloved Dr. Muhammad Ahmed here in Philadelphia, formerly Max Stanford, who he himself applied the teachings of James Boggs, of Robert F. Williams, of all of these folks into the context of Black Philadelphia in the 60s and the 70s to create the organizations that he did, ultimately bringing Malcolm X into the Revolutionary Action Movement, who himself went off to Africa and learned from Pio Pinto Gama, right? Who learned from Marxist folks in Africa to apply back to the context. Stop stripping Dr. King and Coretta Scott King of their socialism and their Marxisms. Don't let these bourgeois institutions, their nonprofits, their media lie to you. The answer's already there. Join the revolutionary parties. Join the revolutionary organizations that exist. Struggle inside of them. Struggle inside of them to make them what they can be. Build your own. But nonprofits aren't going to do it, and autonomous mass mobilizations are not going to take us to the promised land. And that comes from George Jackson, among so many other people.
Right on. We touched on a lot. I appreciate it. I do have folks. I've tried to catch some questions that have come along the way, but if you have others, feel free to drop them in the chat. There is one other thing I'm going to ask you to recount, because today is the defund Hiram, get Hiram in trouble day. Clearly, and so
I'm gonna hear about it.
I know.
It's
I'm
fine.
sorry, but also I will help you find a new job afterwards. So
you have to help me find new friends too.
I'm here for you.
Friends, new job.
So you've told me a little bit, off air. We've talked a little bit about. You've talked about the identity reductionists to some degree. One of the things that we haven't discussed too deeply are some of the gender discussions that have happened specifically in this last 10 years.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I mean, there's a story that you told me that's local here to Philly that I don't know if you want to get into. I'm not going to drop too many details, and you can decide on that. So you could either go specific with your own experience, with this, or you could go more broadly. But I think it's important to address, because I think you do it, with a care. I think it's obviously a difficult conversation to have.
Yeah.
And yeah. So yeah. Anyways, go ahead.
I don't remember the story you're referring to. Maybe you can drop it in the chat or whatever. But the identity piece, the identity piece is a key fixture of this last 10 years that let's just label, right, like this sort of like BLM moment or whatever, right? Not necessarily the organization itself, but just the name that's been given to this last 10 years of black struggle. In that time, and from the very beginning, there was a correct assessment that the errors of the past, the erasure of women, the erasure of queer and trans folks, the erasure of non-gender, right, all marginalized identities from the history of those stories, be it from the Black Panthers all the way to the civil rights movement and even Marxist history, right? When I ran down the names of individuals, they were mostly men, with the exception of Queen Mother Moore, and I acknowledge that, right? The errors of that past, of correcting that. And so there was an emphasis put on lifting up the voices of women, specifically Black women, queer identified folks, which I think is a correct one. And through that work has definitely transformed a lot of how we have understood those identities, have understood those histories, have understood the contributions of those folks, and can never be, I don't think they can ever be erased again. What ended up happening because of philanthropy, and I lay the blame at philanthropy, always the blame at philanthropy first, because they are the ones who are acting intentionally. They're the ones who are acting right from a place of interest and whatever. Created these situations where funding started to be earmarked and benchmarked for specific identities. We have whole funding streams for organizations like Black-led organizations, funding streams that are for organizations that are led by Black, queer, and femme folks. There are funding streams that are for specific boom, 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 right? And they hopped on this, the correct assessment that something needed to be done to correct the errors of the past around the place, the rightful place in which women, queer, trans, non-gender conforming folks sit in the history of Black radical justice and revolutionary tradition across the globe, right? And manipulated it so that then they created these situations where that was sort of like the only thing. And there was an overcorrectness that began to happen. And then with social media, which you can't trust Twitter, because we learned the state will create their own things and cause dissent and disruption in there, right? But an overcorrectness that then what you saw was spaces, convenings, conferences that were pretty much like 90% women, gender non-conforming folks or whatever, and very little to almost no cis heterosexual men. Being a cis heterosexual male in those spaces, after a while, became a little tense, not because of the treatment that you're getting or people saying or whatever, but because it was like, where do I fit in this? Is it my place to speak? Is it my place to offer some sort of analysis? Is that because we were all learning? We were all learning, right? And so you have to give grace to folks because we were all learning. This was the first time this had been done, but we didn't know. But there were also so few of us. And it creates, when you look visually at the marches and the rise of this time in this last 10 years, where it's like predominantly women, it's like, well, where the men at? Well, the men don't care. So you get corporate media and you get their acolytes and things to write disparaging messages about Black men. Right? And you have the griot and the root in these places writing things like, well, Black men are the white men of Black people, and all kinds of crazy stuff. That is Black women who saved democracy with 98% loyalty to the Democratic Party. You know what I'm saying? If it wasn't for them. But Black men are right behind with like 94%, 92%, right? Like they were just talking about this on Black Power Media yesterday, I think it was, with Kamau and Jared and those folks. But the narrative that gets spun is that Black men are voting for Donald Trump, that Black men are somehow betraying their community, they're betraying democracy, they're betraying that. But that comes from, right, the top, from philanthropy and the funding that's going into organizations for specific things. So when I write grants, and I had to write grants or whatever, they always ask for demographics. What's the demographics of your staff? What are the demographics of your, under the guise of, we want to make sure that the resources are getting to the communities. But no, it's specific for that, because when I read that, I understand I have to have the right demographics in place, or else I may not get this funding. And now I have to prioritize folks, which becomes tokenizing to those individuals as well. It doesn't serve anybody. It becomes tokenizing to those marginalized identities as well. But it created this dynamic where then you had not only men, cishet men, not feeling comfortable in these spaces, in these convenings, in this work, in these mobilizations, right? But again, going back to the class character of this, you also had regular, everyday community folks who didn't feel comfortable in those spaces either, because the influx of academics, of these lawyers, right? All of these nonprofit lawyers, they're run by former adjunct professors, they're run by lawyers, they're run by, right? Like all of this stuff. You may have academics who hop up on here and I do my organizing work for free because no one should be paid to do organizing or whatever. Well, motherfucker, you get a check from the University of whatever. And I'm sorry, I don't mean to curse, right? You're getting a check from the City University of New York. You're getting a check from the city, the State University system of California, while you do your organizing on the side for free, and then try to shame the rest of us who don't have no degrees, who don't have nothing, and have to try to find a job, somewhere. And so what that created was this dynamic where then led to the creation of Black Men Build, right? The national organization Black Men Build, because then it was like this dilemma. The media is telling you Black men are voting for Donald Trump, and they're starting it again. They're starting it again now. Black men are voting for Donald Trump. Are there folks who are voting for Donald Trump? There's a lot of people voting for Donald Trump. Nobody loves Donald Trump more than white people. That's just right. Nobody loves Donald Trump more than white people. White women, white men love him to death. We can stop that. But philanthropy creates these narratives where then it just becomes these very singular issues. And so it wasn't so much about, oh, well, the mass population of folks who are incarcerated. It's hyper-focused on, well, the rising numbers of women and girls who are being in prison, when men still make almost 90-something%, right, of that prison population of the Black community. And I'm not saying it is wrong to focus on these areas, because some of these things have to be corrected. But the way that those genuine desires and those genuine assessments are then taken by philanthropy and spun and flipped, right, becomes sometimes blind to the naked eye, and folks end up involving themselves in this sort of like insidious thing, undermining what could be a broader struggle, because the goal is to separate the community as much as possible. And so if you have Black women and Black men on opposite sides of the spectrum, heterosexual folks, transgender, queer enough on opposite sides of the spectrum, then you can't create a Black liberation movement. You can only create silos of identity-based organizations. They did this again with Obama's Black Men and Boys initiative. They do it for men and boys as well. It's not just this, right? Philanthropy will always use anything and everything it can to try to break up and sever the community and our people, so that it doesn't form one mass organization and one mass movement. And so what does that look like? So the point that you're talking about was the Mama's bailouts. And in 2017, there was a national call. They had started out in Atlanta, and the point of the Mama's bailouts were to bring attention to the issue of cash bail, that so many people are sitting in jails because they can't afford bail for nothing else other than an inability to afford bail, right? So you're being imprisoned because you're poor. It was to raise the awareness that, you have a lot of women, girls, but specifically even further marginalized identities like trans women, trans girls, and folks who can't find jobs anywhere, right? Who are some of the most unemployed, who suffer some of the most houselessness, who suffer some of the most interpersonal violence, but also state violence at the hands of the police, and then who also have to sit in jails where they're not saving them for a multitude of reasons, right? Because they can't afford to pay bail. And so it's like, well, how, so then it was used Mother's Day, which is there to everyone, to remember these folks and to raise this issue of bail reform that ultimately will not just benefit queer and Black folks or Black women, but everybody who can't afford to pay bail. So here in 2017, PSU, as a part of the 215 No Jails Coalition that stopped the building of a new jail because they wanted to build a new jail over on State Road or whatever, we stopped that from being built. So there's another hat tip right to the nonprofits. There you go. And other organizations launched a Mama's Bailout in 2017 to bail out mothers here in the city of Philadelphia. What we found and what you're getting at is in terms of identity was that when we got to the courts, because it was PSU that was doing it, I was director of PSU, I had to fill out like, it must have been like 200 forms I had to sign, right, to post bail for folks. But the folks in the courthouse over on Filbert Street were really excited, right? And it was surprised, like they were really excited that we were there to bail folks out. And they were like, this is amazing. This is beautiful. This is, wow, I've never seen anything like we never, right? And it was a trip because like you are inside these institutions, but these institutions are our people. Our people find jobs where they can get jobs. And they recognized, right? They recognized the violence of the institutions that they also work in, but you need a job. And they were like, thank you. Yes, by all means. And they did everything possible to make it as easy for me to sit there and sign 200 forms, right? Legal documents and forms for the paying of this or whatever. And the question that gets asked as I'm leaving, the sister behind the counter asked me, she's like, will we see you on Father's Day? I was like, I don't know. Right? That became not at the national level, but for us locally, right, was something that was like, is there going to be a Father's Day bailout? Well, right, in the broader movement, right, that's not what they were supporting. Now, the bailout, ultimately, the bail reform would benefit men as well, but there wouldn't be a Father's Day bailout because that touched on so many other issues and people's personal dynamic, right, around that thing. But it was this dynamic because also philanthropy is not going to allow you or support the bailing out of those individuals they consider to be super predators, who are the worst of the worst in the eyes of the United States. And a nonprofit movement that goes along with that because of its disconnect to the community. It didn't wrestle. Didn't wrestle with that. The mama's bailout was then taken on by other folks here in the city of Philadelphia. We left it, but that was only one of like the contradictions that came up with it, right? The other piece was around what are the services for folks when they come out of jail, and that was a very real thing. We would talk to families, and we get their permission first. We talk to the person who was inside. We also talk to their families. Listen, we want to, bail out your loved one from jail. Will you be able to take them in and care for them? There were some folks who were like, no, I can't. They're better off in there. They can get their drug treatment. They can get their whatever in there. We had some folks who said, I don't want to be bailed out. I'm better here because I can get my treatment. I can't afford, rehab. I can't afford these things outside because of the violence of capitalism. Keep me in here. We find that a lot with the abolition talk that is all the rave now. And so when you move from defund in 2019, by 2020, Joe Biden and company are like, no, we don't like defund. And they roll out Barack Hussein Obama again to say like, well, defund is a bad Muslim, defund, whatever. And there's an attack on defund. And so then all the foundations stopped giving money for defund campaigns. So the reason you don't see a lot of defund campaigns anymore is because the funding has left for that. They were for body cams, they stopped. Then it was like invest, then it stopped. Now it's narrative change. So there's a lot of communication stuff and narrative things and communications sort of thing, because nonprofits have to produce. In a market economy, you have to produce. So what does that look like? It looks like a lot of reports. It looks like a lot of toolkits. It looks like a lot of convenings. It looks like a lot of, like, I can teach you all the ways to get funding, right? Create learning spaces where folks can come in and learn from each other and convene. Write reports and toolkits that folks on the ground can use, and they can, help there as a technical assistance or whatever. Provide technical assistance in the ways of communication services, especially because of narrative change, narrative. Those are the ways. If you want to start a nonprofit, there you go. And policing, that's what's going to get you funding. Does that address anything? No, it does not. Absolutely not. But that's the point, right? And so then when they roll that out, you literally have, and it is confirmed because I have friends in all of these institutions, right? It's really confirmed that the White House called big foundations, the ones who set the trends. The White House has direct ties, calls them and say, enough with the defund. The presidents and the folks and directors of all those foundations then tell their program officers, it's done with that. The program officers then come back to us and be like, well, we're not funding that, but we do fund this. And because the goal now, because you're in this system, I have lights to pay, I have salaries that have to be paid out, I need that funding. All right, then I'm going to do this because I've got to pay that, or I got to keep my own job. And so you never learn the lessons. You never have time to run campaigns to full length and learn the lessons and learn your organizing, because it's constantly switching. It's constantly switching. It's constantly switching intentionally. But when it came to defund, it came all the way from the White House down, right? All the way and trickle all the way down to us, which is why the police are funded more than they've ever been before. And they're killing more people than they ever have before. And so now you're allowed to say abolition because abolition is a term and the abolition as a framework has been depoliticized. And abolition now has taken the place of Black liberation movement in these last 10 years, right? As a sort of like umbrella term that could mean a whole bunch of things, a lot of things. Again, Erica Keynes in Hood Communist wrote a piece on this not too long ago. Geo and the Du Bois Movement School speak to this, right? That you can't have abolition without a total reconstruction of the country. And they'll speak more about that when they come in. But Geo is some of the only ones who really try to situate abolition in its truest form. It is Geo, right, who taught me that Marx was an abolitionist. Engels are abolitionists. When you read the manifesto, when you read State and Revolution, when you read, they talk about abolishing the state, abolishing, right, private property, abolishing these institutions. Abolition is not disconnected from. Now, when you talk about carceral abolition, then the credit goes to those of the anarchist tradition who have mainly held that, right, when it comes to like policing and jails for a very long time. And that has to be acknowledged. But doesn't mean that abolition is severed from Marxism or severed from socialism. But what you understand now through this nonprofits is because the nonprofits have taken abolition on, and these academics have taken abolition on, abolition becomes this catch-all that means anything and everything. I don't have to actually have an actual ideology. I don't want to identify as a Marxist because I don't want to piss off them. I don't want to identify as an anarchist because I don't want to piss off them. I don't want to be beholden to any ideology or whatever because screw those. Those are just all dead Europeans anyway. I kind of want to do my own thing. Because academics too have to produce. And so I need to keep writing books to carve out that I am the abolition person. I am the one. And so now you have a nonprofit movement that keeps spouting abolition, calling anything and everything abolition, and doesn't mean anything at all. And does the same thing that the last 10 years did with Black liberation. It just takes the energy and what would be fertile ground for an actual revolutionary struggle and spins it into a cycle of idealism, electoralism, and all other kinds of nonsense. And so to call yourself abolitionist can mean all kinds of things. But for the most part, it's again a virtual signal that you don't actually have to hold a politic. You can be like, I'm an abolitionist, and somehow that inherently means that you're a very highly moral person, or you're on the right side of history, without having to prove that or study that or do that. Which also doesn't take into consideration what do you do with the state. Right? What do you do? And Orsami's Tip of the Spears, and again, deals with this issue of abolition, but from the George perspective and from those who are inside the walls themselves. Right? Because abolition didn't start with Angela Davis. It started with those brothers and sisters who were behind those walls fighting those fights. generating the intellectual work that they were doing as prisoners that gets dismissed because they don't have fancy degrees and they don't have platforms, but also their blood sacrifice. They paid for it in blood. That said, these institutions go when capitalism goes. Ori proves it is a site of war, literal warfare for the future of the country and the future of the empire. But we also know from Marx, from Lenin, from all these folks, from Bolivia, from Venezuela, right, that you can take the state, you can have your revolution, take the state. If that bourgeois element is still existing, they will come back. They will do everything possible to undermine your revolution. You see it in Cuba, you see it, right? They will do everything possible to undermine your revolution, to undermine your work, to undermine everything you're building if they are not neutralized in one way or another. And that's the question that gets asked in Tip of the Spear by one of the brothers inside the wall. Well, what do we do with Richard Nixon? You put him in jail or you put him up against the wall. There really is no other, there is no, right? Because they're not accepting anything less on their side. But when you have the loosely termed abolition, like, yeah, and it's community gardens and it's all a million experiments and it's all kinds of stuff or whatever, like, yeah, I think wonderful things do come from there. Like I said, the crisis prevention providers, the mental health, like there's a lot of wonderful projects that have been created. It doesn't deal with the main contradiction at hand. What is the future of this state? And like George said, what are we waiting for? We're going to be left with a desert because we're caught up in this nonprofit stuff, doing these little things and not looking at that. But our framework here doesn't answer that. What does that mean you're an abolitionist? Is it how Marx and Engels meant it? Is it how George Jackson implied it? Is it how, right, like Jalil Munta Kim in Tip of the Spear talks about it? Or is it how philanthropy is funding you to talk about it?
Yeah, I want to say something quickly on that too, because I think one of the things we've been doing a study group, we just started it last night, actually was the first thing, but there's been some prior conversations on here as well. We've been talking about counterinsurgency, which is obviously something we're talking about here today as well. And one of the key focuses in counterinsurgency is narrative. And part of the reason I would say that abolition became a dominant phrase with, like, especially around the George Floyd rebellion, that it got welcomed, right? Why are people being platformed, right, into mainstream media or to say these words, right? And it was weird to watch it at the time because you're like, whoa, we're not used to abolition being a thing that is acknowledged or spoken about in these outlets. Usually they would just,
Right.
It's outlandish. Why would they talk about that?
Right.
And I think what I would say is that counterinsurgency understands that one of the keys is to create a strategic counterinsurgency narrative. And this can have multiple strategies. One strategy I'm very sure of was to confuse people also on what abolition is. There was a whole lot of discussion of, defund doesn't actually mean reduce the funding of police. Defunding actually means,
right.
Fund other things, right?
Mm-hmm.
There was, and then there was also a platforming of some folks who I think are good people, good organizers, etc., but who would not speak about abolition in the terms that you are, or I would say that I would try to if I was discussing it, and so I think that, there's been a lot of questions about abolition here. Maybe I'll raise up one from the chat. Ricky, Erica Keynes, who wrote the piece you were talking about, the limitations of the abolition movement. I think I think what I would say in best faith is that I know some folks who organize under banners of abolition who I think do really good principled work,
Yeah.
who are not a part of a nonprofit, and
Yep.
also don't have any misgivings about the abolition of the state or the abolition of capitalism, and can articulate that because they study and they
Yeah.
struggle and they work together and they build, a cadre organization essentially, right? And so, I think that in some ways, they're part of what happens with abolition is what Femi Taiwo would call elite capture, right? Which is like it gets brought into the narrative so that then all these different narratives about it can come out and all these different people can get promoted. And like you say, it can become the thing that
Yes.
goes in our bios on Instagram and Twitter.
Yep.
And it can mean anything from, hey, let's vote for Joe Biden for harm
Yeah.
reduction, or
Yep.
something completely different from that. And so, like,
Yeah.
Dylan Rodriguez talks about, I don't really use the term to identify myself anymore.
Right.
I feel very similarly of like, it's not
Right.
really the thing that I want to use at this time because there's so much confusion around it.
Right.
I still adhere personally to an abolition that I believe is based in communist theory. As you said, Marx is quite clear, the abolition of the state, the abolition of classes, the abolition of private property angles too, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so, like, I don't envision a world of, if when we reach communism someday, that we will still need at that point, massive prisons to be able to lock
Right.
people away in. But there's a long struggle to get there, and there's a lot of
It's
things
a
we have to
long,
address along the
long
way
struggle.
that is not just like,
Right.
oh, well, we can just get rid of prisons. Like,
Yeah.
first of all, that they're going to let us get rid of prisons and police under
Right.
this capitalist system, like
Right.
that's even something that we can do. So, yeah, I don't know if you have other things you want to address
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
that, but
I mean, you said it, right? You said it. There is an intentionality in elevating these voices, just like Black liberation and Black lives and all those things. And it was a way for folks to, like, elevate themselves into these positions. Folks use abolition to do the same thing. There are brilliant minds who have been working on this issue for a very, very long time. Critical Resistance, Ruth Gilmore, and Angela Davis, right? Contemporary folks like Andre Ritchie, Mariam Kaba, right? Folks who've been working on these things for so long. But it elevates everyone, that there's all kinds of different narratives around it. So what are the limitations? So when Ricky asked what are the limitations to abolition, one of the limitations is that it doesn't have a clear, right, like grounding, like a clear ideological grounding. So it can be interpreted in any which way by anybody at any time, confusing folks as to what that means, right? I think that the way it is articulated now, and the way it's understood now, is a all in one swoop sort of framework, right? It's sort of thing like, get rid of all of them, none of this transition period thing, right? So on one end, you can talk about what do we do with the rapists, what do we do with the murderers, what do we do with those people, right? And those are those conversations that folks have. But then it's just like, well, what do you do with the ruling class elements that are still going to be around? You can't restorative justice your way out of that, right? And we see what they've done in Cuba. We see what they've done in Venezuela. See what they've done in Bolivia. The other thing is the use, and Ricky, you have written this, right, in your piece, the use of abolition as a framework, the same way Black Lives Matter and queer Black feminist lens, right, was exported into other countries to destabilize and undermine revolutionary struggles in places like Cuba and these other countries, right? Where now the United States is exporting, and what is seen as United States' social justice movement or politics, right, is being exported out to these other countries to get them into, either struggles around identity-focused, fights, siloing, severing these movements or whatever, or to this point that we're talking about specifically, the issue around police. And we saw that in June 11th of 2020 with the mass uprisings in Cuba, right, during the COVID period, where there was this notion of like the anti-police struggle, the police are abusing the police or whatever. Anyone who's been to Cuba and who understands that the role of the police plays a very different function than what the police play here. If you've gone to Cuba, you barely even see police, right? But they play a very different function. Now, am I going to be like red cops are so much better than other cops? No, cops suck, period, right? If you ask any citizen anywhere, cops suck. But fundamentally, and politically they play a very different role. And so the purpose of exporting that to Cuba, right, and to say, oh, that's a police state, using terms like a police state. Those are cops attacking marginalized identities, queer and black femme individuals in Cuba. Therefore, the Cuban government is homophobic and racist in a police state and must be overthrown, falls in line with State Department talking points, so that when U.S. aid is paying rappers in Cuba and all this stuff to foment this dissent over there as a way to undermine the socialist project in Cuba, right? It looks like it's done under the guise of social justice, which is coming out of a U.S. framework, which we have spent 2 hours talking about, is paid for by ruling class elites through their philanthropies. And that gets exported across all the countries. So the use of nonprofit organizations in these different countries in collaboration with the CIA, because there is documented collaboration between the CIA and philanthropic organizations here in this to undermine social movements in this country, right, are ways in which so now you see abolition being that. So China is a police state. Cuba is a police state. Everywhere that has is a police state. A cab for everybody, right? But you're not talking about the way that the CIA is in there. U.S. capitalist money is in there, right? In this rising of what folks want to call a multipolar world, in a declining empire, and how they're using these things, how they use these frameworks and these institutions to undermine struggles in those countries and make it look like, everything can be Tahrir Square. Everything can be the Arab Spring and this color revolution, which again, even in those places have proven to be, right, U.S. projects for the purpose of undermining actual revolutionary struggle.
Right on. Just a couple things quickly. So, I mean, there are folks out here with that analysis, right? I'll just say that. And it often folks with that analysis are marginalized from being the sort of dominant speakers within abolition. But I think that, a lot of folks, even a lot of times, I'm not going to name names, but even a lot of times people that I think are more promoted, if they get pressed on this, they have to admit that you have to abolish capitalism. But it's also important, where is it within the narrative, right? Do we have to probe you to say it versus like, is that some front and center?
A basic study of police and the history of police, right? Geo is one. Geo's book, A World Without Police. I've read it 3 times already, right? Is it an incredible, it's a short read, but an incredible breakdown of the history of police, not just from slave patrols, right? Because we just understood it as slave patrols. It wasn't just slave patrols. It was also colonial occupation. It was colonial warfare, right? And those soldiers coming back from Cuba, coming back from Puerto Rico, coming back from the Philippines, and starting the first police departments in this country, right? And working alongside it is the vigilantes, right? The deputizing of vigilantes on the border to murder and attack indigenous communities, but also Mexican folks who are having their country and their lands taken away, and all those things working in the interest of the ruling class elites, these robber barons, who then, shortly after that period, create their charitable organizations. They create their police to protect that wealth. They create nonprofits and charitable organizations to hide that wealth from taxation, right? Without the police in prisons, that line that holds, right, the haves from the have-nots disappears, and this whole thing would crumble, right? And so, yes, if you want to abolish the police, you have to abolish capitalism. There is absolutely no way in hell the state is going to get rid of its armed bodies of men. That's state and revolution, right? All of the stuff has already been written in like 1902, right? The failure of relying on the spontaneous uprisings of the masses to lead some sort of revolution on their own, and the tailism that comes from that is already in what is to be done. Like, all this stuff has already been written. And so who are the folks who say it? So to your point, there's not a lot of folks who say it because they don't have that politic, and they don't hold that politic. Most of the folks you see spouting abolition and all that, they won't identify it, but when you listen to them, just spout either some form of eclecticism, which is a mashup. I'm going to take a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, because that makes me feel good, right? Or they're just liberals. They're rad libs at best. They won't identify. They're rad libs. Even the Dem socks, those who who promote socialism. Right? You've had this rise of socialism, and especially within the nonprofit ranks, and we have to go too deep into that. But there are like communities of folks who are like, no, we're going to build some sort of socialist movement, some sort of socialist organization rooted in the folks who are working in these nonprofits, so that you can combine the two. Or it's just democratic socialist nonsense. It's anti-Soviet Union, anti-Leninism. Right? That has proven to fail. That you know what I'm saying? I don't know where anti-Leninism has won anywhere. I didn't graduate college, so I'm sure a lot of you can prove me something wrong, but you know what I'm saying? From what I've read, and you know what I'm saying, it hasn't happened. But you do have folks who do add the capitalism piece to it, to the abolition. Ruth Gilmore does it, right? Angela talks about it. Robin Kelly does it. Geo does it. What gets missing is that it's spoken of in a vague way. It's intentionally spoken in this vague way that stops just short of, and therefore you need to build revolutionary parties, revolutionary Marxist parties who can begin the process of helping raise the revolutionary consciousness of the masses by starting with their material conditions and taking advantage of the repression that comes from the state when you do that. George Jackson, right? Because it's going to come feeding on the repression that comes from the state, because they are provoked by your working with these folks to do that, to raise the revolutionary consciousness of the folks, then prepare the grounds for when the time is right. And we have no way of predicting when that time will come. But what we can do is prepare the grounds for when it does come, that you can take full advantage of it. They won't say that. That alienates their anarchist friends, that alienates the institutions that they come from. A lot of them also, just because of the types of folks that they are, right? These post-Soviet Union months, they don't really believe in a lot of that stuff. There's a heavy emphasis, if you see, when it comes on Black radical tradition, as opposed to like Marxism, right? That sort of like veers away from that sort of thing. And so all these things are intentionally done. So to your point, yeah, you have a lot of voices who are intentionally confusing, but the folks who do speak of the Marxism and capitalism stop short of the violence. You need a revolutionary party to wage a revolutionary fight to establish, right, what is referred to as a proletarian dictatorship, and to crush these dudes. Because if we don't, we're going to be left in the desert. We're either going to be all dead or left in the desert.
Right on. Yeah, I mean,
I don't know. Were we supposed to name names?
No,
or
no,
was that...
no. Well, if you want to name names, that's
you
fine.
didn't want
I just say to this, because
Yes.
I don't disagree. What I would say is, yeah, exactly in the ways that that Hiram pointed out, in terms of the way that this gets, pushed onto, say, Cuba, or, the way that a lot of whenever China comes up, the discussions that happen around this. What I would say is that, to me, there's something broader which comes up through abolition sometimes, because abolition has become kind of the dominant left-wing discourse that's okay for academics to discuss, it's okay for nonprofits to discuss, etc., right? Is that I actually think that there's anti-communism throughout almost all of the US left, and
Absolutely.
that, like, if you look at Marxist professors, if you look at people who write books, Marxist, inflected books within a lot of these, publishing houses, and that are left presses, that a lot of them, right, that is, anti-communism is often the common denominator. So in some ways, I wouldn't want to necessarily, from my perspective, I know a lot of abolitionists who are not anti-communists, but I recognize it is a small subset of the whole group of people who have become
And I would
abolitionists.
say,
And I would just say this is the case within socialists in the United States. People who call themselves socialists, a lot of them are anti-communist. So anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say, my experience has been more of like an anti-Marxism, right? An anti-Marxism more so than anti-communist. And I know maybe to like the average person wouldn't really like understand the difference there, but understand it because there's a heavy anarchist influence, right? Anarchist professors, anarchist, right, thinkers, who are doing a lot of work, a lot of good work in this field of like abolition. So it's not to take away from the projects and the experiments and all the things that folks are running, because there's a lot of good work that is happening. But the Marxism piece runs in contrast to what they're thinking, and the Marxism doesn't allow for a very simple statement of, all cops are bastards, every last one of them, and therefore all states that use these forms of like policing or whatever, then they too are also bastards, and therefore all states, because all states hold, right, because states need these forces to be able to protect themselves, defend themselves, do all the different things, then therefore states are bad. And so from an anarcho-communist position, right, there's a heavy influence on that. And so I wouldn't say there's a strong anti-communism, there's a strong anti-Marxism that then I think these professors and the notables, be it Ruthie's and the Robbins and the Andrews and those folks, have to then navigate. How do you navigate that gene? Because they've written plenty about the connections between Marxism and abolition. They've done that work for decades, and they speak to it, right? But it's like in this field of nonprofits with all its limitations, and then the relationship of folks who hold a different type of politic and anarcho-communist or whatever, right? That then where's the sweet spot? Where's the sweet spot that falls in? And so you will get a discussion. There will be references to Marx. You will get, but they have to come from respected people like Ruthie and Robin and Angela, who have dedicated decades to this particular issue, right? And who have earned that right. What you're not going to hear is a lot of this transition period stuff, right? That there is a transitional period where you're going to need some sort of force to suppress the pushback and the blowback from the bourgeois elements, that you're going to need a force that's going to have to deal after, let's take this country, over 200 years of capitalist indoctrination, capitalist rule, is going to take probably just as long to undo all of that in the psyche of the citizens and its institutions and all that. It's going to take a while to do that. And therefore the transition of policing and prisons out of that is going to reflect that as well. And folks aren't going to want to hear that, and they're not going to talk about that, because philanthropy is not going to give you a funding for anything that you're going to say is going to take us 100 years to accomplish. And so it's to give grace to those folks who are, I think in their level of expertise are navigating these very real dynamics, while also acknowledging that for all of its challenges, this is the first time I think in the history of this country, and definitely in the world, where like abolition and police abolition and the concept of eradicating prisons and police is on the tongues of almost everyone has an opinion on it. And there's a significant increase in amount of people who support that than there did probably when Critical Resistance or when Ruthie and these folks first started writing their books. And that also has to be acknowledged and respected, right? And the folks who have been pushing that work. So we can criticize all we want, and that's totally fine, but we also have to lift up, right, the victories and the very real accomplishments that are also coming simultaneously out of all of this.
And interestingly, next time we have Ruthie on, which I'm hoping that we will be able to do again, because we did an audio conversation with her a couple of years ago. One of the things that had been a question that we didn't quite get to, but she said a little bit about it at the end. Because one of the questions that I had is like, what is her thinking on the party? And she said that when Critical Resistance was founded, that there were two people who wanted it to be a revolutionary cadre party, an organization, but not just a nonprofit.
Yeah.
And it was her
Yeah.
and Masai Ioji from New African, former political prisoner.
Mm-hmm.
But everybody else was against it.
Yeah.
So part of me wants to really ask her like about that debate and why.
That'd be really interesting.
Yeah. All right. So other things. So quickly, thank you for the super chat, Laura Bar. I don't know how to pronounce this. Librarian. But I appreciate.
Oh, that's a cool name.
I appreciate you. And so Do you have recommendations on some readings or resources on the discussion of professionalization that you were talking about? That this was
Professionalization, I've
back when we were
loved.
talking about in the nonprofit world and so on. You know.
Professionalization. Now, I think the number one book is the one that was written by Insight back in the day, right? The Revolution Will Not Be Funded. It's an anthology. It's a collection of essays. Dylan is in there. I think Ruth is in there. A bunch of folks who are talking about this specific issue and breaking it down as far back as the 90s. Another one that was helpful to me was Dialectics of Black Power by Robert Allen. It's a pamphlet, but goes into specific detail of how philanthropy infused itself inside of the Black Power movement, inside the civil rights movement, and what that meant for those struggles at the time. And then, you can draw connections to that. I would say those two are the ones off the top of my head that are the easiest to read, and I think are the most powerful.
That's great. So this is a great commercial for the George Jackson Organizing School. Can people sign up for it? Is it you have to be tapped on the shoulder?
No. So this spring cohort is already closed. We're going to start the spring cohort. We're going to start another one again. There may be a summer one, but there'll definitely be one in the fall. And so what you can do is hit us up at the Community Resource Hub. So on Twitter, it's at C Resource Hub. Our Instagram is also at C Resource Hub. You can write us at info@communityresourcehub.org, and we'll put you on the list and let you know. And we announce it about a month ahead of time, and we'll try to announce it a little more before that, and announce that, and then you apply and you come through.
Right on. Thank you, Dr. Jared Ball, for becoming a member. I Mix What I Like. Shout out to all. First of all, I'd say about 95% of the people in here right now are Black Power Media chat and
shout out to the remixes.
Yeah, exactly. I'll answer this. So this was brought up as a question when I was asking a kind of vague question to you about gender dynamics. Basically, what I would just say is that Hiram and I had a prior discussion off air, because, as far as my process on doing these, I usually, folks who have watched for a long time, like Josh and I usually read people's stuff and we engage it, we develop questions and we come up. And so I knew I've always appreciated things that you've had to say, but because there wasn't a specific essay we were going to or piece of writing, we had a conversation that was a great conversation. So I asked it in a vague way, in part because I didn't know how much Hiram would want to go into some of the specifics because of how difficult a conversation it is, and I think you did a great job. But it is, I recognize that these things are tricky, and yeah, so that was what I was referencing and speaking vaguely. It wasn't something that you had said previously in this conversation that drew me to that question. So it also didn't come out of nowhere. I just say,
the Father's Day bailout question.
Yeah.
I mean, one thing to be clear too, and I know the folks who started the Mama's bailout back in Atlanta and all that would say, right? Like, look, and they will tell you themselves, they don't own any of this. Right? They don't own the ideas. They don't own, any of these things. So nothing is stopping really anyone. Is philanthropy going to pay for it? Probably not. Right? Is it going to get like a whole lot of support from every sector of the movement? Probably not. Will it find support? Yeah, it will. Right? I think folks end up being also at capacity, right? Because a lot of these organizations, these nonprofit organizations, are running like under capacity, right? And so just can't do everything right. So nothing is stopping, right? To be very clear, there is no coordinated movement trying to stop a Father's Day bailout or trying to stop, people connecting Marxism to abolition or stop it, right? Like there's more than enough space for folks to get in. Are you going to have the platform and the resourcing and the stuff that the other folks are? Probably not. But if that's not your concern primarily, then nothing stops you from doing it, right? And this was to end, to end it here, going all the way back again, and always wanted to be fair to everyone because it's all contradiction, and I sit in this, right? So I start to cross self-criticisms with myself. I am not, and we are not somehow better than or have figured out than other folks. No, we are in it just like everybody else, making as many mistakes as everybody else. So when I talk about the nonprofit organization, when I talk about these struggles, I'm including myself, and I want to be very clear about that, right? Like PSU was a part of the M4BL network and movement from its inception all the way up until 2017 when I left PSU, right? And so I'm not removing myself from this. I'm just speaking from my experiences being in these things for the last 20 years, right? But if you don't like something, and I used to get into these arguments all the time with like, oh, that BLM and whatever, and is just for gay people, the gay agenda stuff, or the women and all this. It's like, fine. Let's say it is. Let's go with it. All right, let's say it is. What are you doing? What are you doing? Right? Nothing is stopping you from organizing whatever it is that you want. And as an organizer, we always learn, if you don't like what somebody is doing, out organize them. Create your own project and let the people decide. Simple. Sitting on the sidelines, cursing out people or being mad because, oh, those nonprofit, those people, or that does nothing. Nothing. If you don't like it, do something different, and then let the people decide. Let the work prove itself. I spent 2 years as a 5%er, right? That was the key. Show and prove. It was show and prove. Everything I sit there and be like, oh man, the devil God, the white devil. And they would stop me in the chat. It's like, who cares? What are you doing? What are you building? Because if it's nothing, then shut up. You can have the most accurate analysis in the world. Wonderful. It means nothing. Because you're not building anything. You're not doing anything. And so in terms of the genesis of the father's bailout, doesn't mean that it can't happen. It's just that for whatever reason, folks just haven't done it.
Yep. Yeah, and I think it's always going to be harder, in terms of organizing the actual revolutionary movement that we want, building the revolutionary organizations. Those things are not going to be funded, and so it is going to be harder. But that is absolutely true that, my comrade Brooke says this all the time of just like, look, when I get too pissed off at these other groups, it becomes a self-critique because it's like, why am I not able to organize the thing? Why are me and my comrades not able to organize the thing that can actually, outflank them, can actually, okay, they get up front in this struggle or that struggle. Why are we not up front in this struggle? It's not just, because of, the resources can be a part of that, and it's something you have to contend with, but it's also, it becomes you kick yourself in the butt and you say, okay, well, we need to organize this, and do this better, and so, but I think that the everything that you've laid out today, I think is really important for folks, and I appreciate it. And I will help you find your next gig when they tell you that the funding has dried up.
The funding has dried up, and I end up with no more friends. But
I can't help you with friends, but you're an organizer, so you'll make more friends, like, but happens. Hey man, I really do appreciate this conversation. It's been great.
Thank you so much for it.
I'm sorry I didn't get to everybody's questions in the chat. There was more traffic on this chat, I think, than anything that we've done so far in terms of a live. So
if folks have questions, they can drop them in the comments on the YouTube, and I can come back and I can commit to answering them. I don't know if I'll be able to answer them all in the day, but I can commit to coming back and answering questions that are left in the comments. And again, these are my opinions, right? Like they may be right, they may be wrong, but they're based off my experience, and would love to hear other folks' experiences, and definitely would love to hear, folks like, my experience is different, Hiram, or I don't see it that way, or here's how I think that's the only way that we can get to that place. And the last thing I would say is, absolutely, be taking anything away from this, join Revolutionary Organization. join the revolutionary parties, right? Get in there and do the work, criticize from the, once you've had it. And if they don't exist, right, there's Party for Socialism and Liberation, there's the DSA, there's, like I said, the AARP, there's the multitude of them that exists. And if those don't fit for whatever reason, right, then start creating something, but don't just do nothing, right? Don't just do nothing, because activism, like just showing up to mobilizations, isn't going to be enough. It's going to take a lot more.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. I'm going to get us out of here with that.
Thank you.
All right.
All right, bro.
Thank you.